members around the world. We're based in Boston with offices in New York, Los Angeles, Palm Beach, Washington, D.C., and Jerusalem. CAMRA is the pioneer and leader in monitoring media coverage of Israel and the Middle East. We work to promote accurate coverage through systematic attention to reporting, fact-checking, intensive interaction with journalists, editors, producers, and executives, and the engagement of the voices of our nearly 20,000 activists. Later about why we at CAMRA and many in the Jewish community are fully aware of the long wait on Israel's behalf. Lord Arthur Balfour spelled out British support for the restoration.
It's nothing more than a customized version of 2,000-year-old replacement theology, which maintains that Christians and the Church have replaced Jews and Israel as the purposes of God. Later this morning, Gloria Cardozo-Moore will discuss in depth the rising threat of replacement theology to Israel and the Jewish people. But in order to lay a foundation for what I think, according to this belief, the Jews who now live in Israel are of European descent and only appeared in the land in the 19th century. Therefore, Palestinians are the rightful owners of the land, and they are being oppressed by illegal occupiers. In other words, the Jewish state is illegitimate. The assertion that Palestinians have owned the land for 2,000 years promotes a political cause, but it also has other far-reaching ramifications. The logical conclusion of the claim that Palestinians are indigenous to the land is the belief that Jesus was a Palestinian. After all, how could Jesus have been Jewish if there were no Jews in the land when he was born there? This is, in fact, what many Palestinian Christians believe, and there are serious consequences from this politically inspired theology. The invention of a Palestinian Jesus denies the Jewishness of Jesus and deconstructs the foundations of Christian faith by severing that faith from its Jewish roots and context. As a result, the Christian faith is delegitimized. But a Palestinian Jesus is also dangerous for Jews. When Jesus is separated from his Jewishness, the way is paved for the same demonization and dehumanization of the Jewish people that resulted from the Nazis' identification of Jesus as an Aryan. We know from history where this road leads. With this explanation of the theological underpinnings of this politically motivated movement in mind, I want to talk now about three significant developments that threaten future evangelical support of Israel, all of which began in 2010. 2010 was the year the first in a series of conferences known as Christ at the Checkpoint was held in Bethlehem. Since 2010, this gathering has been hosted every 2 years in Bethlehem, with an upcoming one this coming March. Bethlehem Bible College, identified as an evangelical Christian college, and the president of the school is a man by the name of Jack Sarah. Through the outreach of this school, American evangelicals are targeted with a one-sided message that is based on Palestinian replacement theology, fallacious charges of racism and apartheid, and a flawed historical narrative. The majority of the participants at Christ at the Checkpoint, sponsored by Bethlehem Bible College, are American evangelical leaders who return to the U.S. and propagate a narrative that is nothing more than Christian anti-Zionism, and that is nothing more than the new manifestation of Christian anti-Semitism. Dexter Van Zyl will go into more detail about Bethlehem Bible College and Christ at the Checkpoint, but I introduced these two institutions at this point because of their relationship to Palestinian theology and other significant developments in 2010. But for my purposes right now, it's important to note that through content and imagery, these Palestinian Christians promote a very clear message. Israelis are oppressing them in the same way first-century Jews allegedly persecuted Christ. The implication is, if Jesus lived in Bethlehem today, he would have to go through checkpoints just like the Palestinians do, because remember, according to them, Jesus was a Palestinian. But in reality, Jesus would not be allowed into the Bethlehem of today, not because of the Israelis, but because of the Palestinian Authority, which has declared that all territory under their control will be Judenrein. This reality leads me to point out an obvious, glaring inconsistency in the Palestinian narrative. On one hand, the claim is made that Jesus was a Palestinian, since according to their political script, there were no Jews in the land 2,000 years ago. But on the other hand, the message from Bethlehem Bible College and Christ at the Checkpoint is that if Jesus lived today, he would be oppressed by the Israelis in the same way he was persecuted by first-century Jews. But how could Jesus have been persecuted by Jews if they weren't there when he was there? Which is it? Were there Jews in the land 2,000 years ago or not? Unfortunately, this propaganda does not let facts or standard methods of biblical interpretation get in the way. What is important for the sake of the Palestinian narrative is the perpetuation of the two millennia last summer as an example of just how vile Christian anti-Zionism can get. What appears to be the obvious analogy between the Jewish state and a miry cream for pigs. Now, I don't need to say any more about that. We know the history of that. But this is just one of a number of highly offensive and dangerous videos produced by Christ at the Checkpoint and its sponsoring institution, Bethlehem Bible College, both of which are under the leadership of President Jack Sarah. The second significant development of 2010 was the production of a virulently anti-Israel Christian documentary titled Little Town of Bethlehem. This documentary was produced by Mark Green, one of the owners of the retail chain Hobby Lobby. It was produced under the direction of Sammy Awad of the Holy Land Trust. The Holy Land Trust is a pro-Palestinian organization headquartered in Bethlehem that also helps sponsor Christ at the Checkpoint conferences. In short, this film presents a false narrative consistent with that of Christ at the Checkpoint. It is nothing more than propaganda that demonizes and delegitimizes the Jewish state. It has been shown on evangelical college campuses and in evangelical churches across the United States. It's made a significant contribution to the promotion of the Palestinian agenda to undermine evangelical support of Israel. Again, I'm going to leave the rest of this discussion to Dexter, that every person on earth would have an authentic encounter with Jesus Christ through the power and presence of the Holy Spirit by Pentecost 2033. End of quote. According to this organization, in order for their mission to be accomplished, evangelical Christians worldwide must be united. I attended Empower 21's international conference this past May in Jerusalem. Every speaker in the main sessions over the course of 4 days, morning, afternoon, and night, in some way emphasized the necessity of Christian unity in order to realize the goal of world evangelization. There is a twofold problem with this call to unity. The first is that no definition was given by any of the speakers as to what the leadership of Empower 21 means by their use of the word unity. As a result, the probability is that conference attendees will interpret this call according to a dictionary definition, which is, quote, the state of being in full agreement. In other words, unity requires agreement. Second, in the absence of any definition or parameters for this unity, and in light of Empower 21's unreflective support for and involvement with Palestinian Christian leaders as demonstrated in Jerusalem in May, it appears that Empower 21 is calling evangelicals to stand in unity with those who promote a political narrative that demonizes Jews and delegitimizes the Jewish state. Empower 21's relationship with Palestinian Christians is demonstrated in part by the inclusion of Jack Sarah, president of Bethlehem Bible College, as one of the leaders in the conference in Jerusalem. As president of Bethlehem Bible College, Sarah is not only responsible for the college's promotion of Palestinian replacement theology and anti-Israel propaganda, but he is responsible for the way this school targets the American evangelical audience with this message. Furthermore, Jack Sarah is responsible for the anti-Zionist message promoted at Christ at the Checkpoint conferences. And he's responsible for the videos produced by Christ at the Checkpoint, such as the one I just showed you. Because of his involvement in Empower 21, it appears that a Christian with these beliefs is to be included among those with whom Empower 21 advocates unity or the state of being in full agreement. But how can evangelicals stand in unity with those who promote a political agenda built on a foundation of lies, rewritten history, and anti-Jewish theology? How can evangelicals who claim to believe what the Bible says also claim to be in unity with those who reinvent Jesus as a Palestinian, deny the Jewish roots of Christianity, and maintain that Christians and the church have replaced Jews and Israel in the purposes of God? There is no true unity without agreement. This emphasis on unity at the expense of truth is evidenced by the relationships between leaders of Empower 21 and Palestinian leaders such as JUDEO. And this means that Empower 21 could well become a vehicle for the international promotion of the Palestinian Christian anti-Zionist narrative. This would represent the most extensive threat to evangelical support of Israel we have seen yet, simply because of the worldwide reach of Empower 21. At this point, I want to give you some data points to illustrate the connections between the three significant developments I just discussed. The chairman of Empower 21 is Dr. Billy Wilson. Wilson was a speaker at the Christ at the Checkpoint conference in March 2014. And Wilson is responsible for the inclusion of Palestinian leaders such as JUDEO in Empower 21. Wilson is also the president of Oral Roberts University, an internationally recognized Christian university in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Because of this, ORU now plays a significant role in advancing the Empower 21 movement. With that said, this is a very important aside. I want to make it clear that while the relationship between Billy Wilson, Christ at the Checkpoint, and leaders such as JUDEO is cause for concern, this reality does not reflect on the many ORU professors who wholeheartedly support Israel and understand the importance of Jewish-Christian relations. Prior to the presidency of Billy Wilson, ORU had an exemplary history of support for Israel. And evidence of ORU's historic position is demonstrated by the fact that the vast majority of professors and students still stand with Israel. However, I have to mention ORU because an understanding of the relationship between the current leadership and the leadership of Bethlehem Bible College and Christ at the Checkpoint is essential in order to understand the danger represented by the goals of Empower 21. The concern over these relationships is magnified by the relationship between the source of funding for ORU, Empower 21, and the film Little Town of Bethlehem, the one that promotes the same anti-Israel propaganda as Bethlehem Bible College. And there's a lot of money involved. Mark Green, the producer of Little Town of Bethlehem, was the chair of the Oral Roberts Board of Trustees from 2008 to 2014. Since 2008, Green has given $250 million to the school, a fact that not only bought him the position of chair of the board, but one that continues to give him an inordinate amount of influence. Empower 21 was Mark Green's idea soon after he became chair of the board. And Empower 21 is supported and promoted by the university that he funded through the leadership of the new president, Billy Wilson. This is the reason ORU now plays a significant role in the advancement of Empower 21. Mark Green, of course, is a member of the board of Empower 21 and was a participant in the conference in Jerusalem, along with JUDEO and other pro-Palestinian pastors. To summarize, in Empower 21, we have a combination of Mark Green's money and influence, his obvious sympathy for the Palestinian Christian narrative, as demonstrated by his production of and continued sale of Little Town of Bethlehem, and the relationship of Empower 21 leadership with Palestinian Christian This does not bode well in terms of the influence this organization may have on evangelical support for Israel internationally. For more detail on my concerns about the potential effects of Empower 21, I refer you to 3 articles that I've written. They're in the folders that you received when you arrived. In closing, I want to remind us of something everyone in this room knows, because you wouldn't be here if you didn't. The one in which we live. We know from history that all it takes for evil to prevail is for good people to remain silent. In the biblical book of Esther, in the context of an impending genocide of the Jews, Mordecai challenged Esther to not remain silent in the face of evil, but to use her position to change the course of history. He also cautioned her that inaction, not doing anything on her part, would not ensure her safety, even in the king's palace. So may we all heed the message of Mordecai and follow the example of Esther. Let us all continue to speak and stand for the truth in relation to Israel. May we do all we can, where we can, for such a time as this. Thank you.
In the United States are more likely than American Jews to believe that God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. And support for Israel in the evangelical community is still robust, but it's not to be taken for granted. Up until about 2010, anti-Israel activism was a marginal aspect of evangelical life in the United States. There was one organization called Evangelicals for Middle East Understanding who blamed the conflict and the suffering it caused on Israel and the Christian Zionists who supported Israel here in the United States. And in 2005, there was a conference at North Park University about the evils of Christian Zionism. And the conference message was that Christian Zionists had embraced a dangerous end-times, Armageddon end-time theology and caused people to ignore the suffering of the Palestinian people. And just as an aside, one of the things that I find very interesting is that the people who basically talk the loudest or scream the loudest about the threat or the dangers of end-times theology of the Christian Zionists haven't said very much about the end-time theology of the mullahs in Iran. But you knew that. So it was a pretty simple message that resonated with the mainline or liberal Protestants and some evangelicals, but it didn't get much traction in the United States and in mainstream evangelicalism. But mainliners, like a lot of people here in the United States, have contempt for evangelical Protestants, and they use this contempt and they capitalized on it to portray evangelical support for Israel as a retrograde movement. And if you were a supporter of Israel, basically, they would point the finger at you and say, you're one of those mean fundamentalist Christians that we don't like. And the thing was, is that the anti-Zionists in the mainline community, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so agitated about what I see happening in the evangelical community, was that it basically, did an enormous amount of damage to the mainline Protestant community. Anti-Zionism started to get traction within the evangelical community about 2010. And Cameron raised a hue and a cry about a growing number of disaffected young people in the evangelical community, and they were embracing anti-Zionism as a way to signal to their non-evangelical friends that they were hip, split, and cool, unlike their parents and grandparents. And there were 2 main pillars of what some commentators have called the evangelical intifada. And one pillar comprised of the Christ at the Checkpoint Conference, organized by a group of Palestinian Christians associated with the Bethlehem Bible College in the West Bank. And the overarching motif of these conferences, which have been held every even-numbered year beginning in 2010 at the Jasper International, a 5-star hotel in Bethlehem, is displayed in a banner behind the speakers at the conference. And if you look closely, basically what you see is you see a church and a cross standing in opposition to and in judgment of a guard tower that sits atop the security barrier. Personally, I think that the security barrier is a blessing. It's a tragic blessing because there are Israeli Jews and Israelis who are alive today that probably would not be because of that security barrier. And there are, in fact, Palestinians that are alive today that would not be alive today if it weren't for that security barrier. But the message offered by this graphic, which has become kind of like the Nike swoosh for the movement, Christ at the Checkpoint, is that Israel's security barrier and Jewish sovereignty itself are obstacles to God's purposes for the Holy Land. And here are some of the conference speakers you've got going from your left to right. You've got Stephen Sizer, Gary Burge, Porter Speakman Jr., Salim Munayer, and Ben White. And if you've been paying attention to these, this is like a rogues gallery, so to speak. Some of the people, and Stephen Sizer is very problematic, and so is Gary Burge. Now, the thing is that the speakers portray Christian support for Israel as a betrayal of Christianity's universalism. For example, Dr. Manfred Kohl, a German theologian, argues that Christian support or acknowledgement of Jewish territorial claims are a betrayal of Christianity and of Jesus himself. For us today, to insist on holding on to some parts of the Old Covenant means not to recognize Christ in his totality. That was one of the things that he said. And this type of argumentation puts Christians who support Israel on the defensive because it forces them to choose between their love of Jesus Christ and the Jews and their concern and love for the Jewish people. Now, speakers at these conferences and others like them in the United States also assert that Christian support for Israel hinders efforts to spread the Christian faith in Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East. And the logic is that because Muslims regard Israel with hostility, evangelical support for Israel puts the Christian faith into a bad light, and therefore makes Muslims less likely to convert to Christianity. Now, given the importance of sharing the faith to the evangelical community, this argument hits home even if it ignores the lack of religious freedom in Muslim-majority countries. Speakers also blame Christian support for the Jewish state in the Middle East for the oppression of Christians in the region. And this is another effective argument because evangelicals are some of the most prominent supporters of organizations that advocate for the persecuted church in the Middle East. Students from Wheaton College attend Christ at the Checkpoint Conference, and they attend under the supervision of Gary Burge, a well-known anti-Israel writer who has proven skillful at enlisting students into the cause of anti-Zionist activism. And here is a photo of some of the graffiti left on the security barrier by students from Wheaton College who attend the Christ at the Checkpoint Conference. It says, "Wheaton College for Christ and no walls." You can see that the students have internalized the message and are now broadcasting the message, the Christ at the Checkpoint logo I showed you a while back. It's just a perfect dovetail. They condemn the wall, but not the terror attacks that prompted its construction. Now, high-ranking officials from the World Evangelical Alliance, the umbrella organization for evangelicals worldwide, have also attended the conference. George Tunnicliffe, then Secretary General of the World Evangelical Alliance, was at the 2014 conference. And at the next conference taking place in March, the new Secretary General, Bishop Ephraim Tendera, will attend. The presence of these officials legitimizes the message offered at Christ at the Checkpoint. Another pillar for the evangelical intifada is comprised of two highly propagandistic movies shown to thousands of young college-age evangelicals at hundreds of colleges and campuses throughout the United States, many of them Christian colleges. One of these was With God on Our Side, which was released in 2010. And when you start to look at what happened in 2010, it becomes increasingly difficult to ignore the possibility that this was a concerted effort. Somebody was behind the organization of this. And I don't want to make it sound like it was a conspiracy, but people have put an awful lot of thought into the effort to delegitimize Israel in the evangelical community. It's part of what I think you could call a cognitive war, which can be described as basically turning us into pacifists and basically inciting hostility towards the enemy on the part of the people in the Middle East. Now, the film produced by Porter Speakman, With God on Our Side, shows the struggles of a young evangelical Christian as he grapples with the continued violence in the Arab-Israeli conflict. He starts out as a strong Christian supporter of Israel, but by the end he has embraced a narrative that blames Israel for the conflict and downplays incitement and anti-Semitism in Palestinian society. The important thing about With God on Our Side was that it provided a visual model for evangelicals to embrace the anti-Israel narrative. Because what happens is that people in the evangelical community understood typically that support for Israel was basically part of the evangelical identity. If you want to break people away from that, you have to give them a path to follow. That's one of the reasons why the Gospels are so important to us as Christians, because we can actually place ourselves And here's a screenshot of the young evangelical speaking on camera about his dark night of the soul. You can see the stained glass behind him, and it's a very dishonest movie, but it's a piece of visual propaganda. It's very effective. The movie suggests that good Christians can ignore Muslim and Arab hostility towards Jews in Israel because of the crimes the Jewish state has committed against the Palestinian people. Now, I've asked Porter Speakman Jr. who paid for the production of this film, and he has never given me the names of the people who bankrolled it. We do know, however, who paid for another, frankly, vulgar anti-Israel movie called Little Town Enough People would claim Israel is their homeland. Here's the movie poster for the movie, and if you can see, it clearly adopts a pro-Palestinian narrative. And the thing is, this guy looks cool, and if you look closely, you're going to see that the guy has a badge or a button of Martin Luther King on his vest, and that's a very important thing. I want to give you some background about the movie. It was written and directed by the former advertising executive Jim Hayman, who had made other movies for Mark Green and which were sold through Mardell's store and website. And as you can see, the poster, the movie offers a blatantly pro-Palestinian narrative. Now, in writing the script for the movie, Jim Hayman spent a lot of time with Holy Land Trust, a Bethlehem-based organization led by Sammy Awad, who comes from a prominent family of Palestinian Christians who have made a family business of demonizing Israel. They made dimitude a family business, okay? If you know what dimitude is, okay? And Hayner also visited with Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, a man who once expressed the desire to kill all the Jews in the world, once they gathered in Israel, of course. And here is a quote that Jim Hayman said after speaking with Nasrallah. Just on a personal level, I found him remarkable. He said that to an evangelical journalist by the name of Jim Fletcher, who's somebody that you should be following, because he's been one of the most dogged reporters on this. Mark Green hired a writer who was smitten by Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of one of the most anti-Semitic organizations on the planet, to produce a film about the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that is simply irresponsible. And the film, which camera recently obtained by purchase through Mardell's website, was shown to approximately 400 venues, including Christian colleges and churches throughout the United States and Europe. And operating under the assumption that these viewings attracted at least 15 attendees a shot, which is a low estimate to be sure, camera concludes that at least 20,000 viewers saw this movie. And we think that's a very low conservative estimate. And it includes only one part of the movie's viewing public, for it was also sold through Amazon and, as stated previously, Mardell's website. It was also used in course materials in colleges and seminaries, including Notre Dame, Biola University, and Palmer Theological Seminary. Those were the syllabuses that I could find just recently, and it could have been used in other campuses as well. And to make matters worse, it received 3 filmmaking awards and was given a positive review by Christianity Today. The movie's wide distribution and the plot it's received are very troubling, given the manner in which it mischaracterized the Arab-Israeli conflict and demonized the Jewish state. The movie, which ostensibly tells the story of the Israeli-Palestinian peace movement through the eyes of an Israeli Jew, a Palestinian Christian, and a Palestinian Muslim, is filled with misstatements of fact, material omissions, and egregious distortions, some of which we have documented in an article that's in your packet. For example, the movie falsely indicates that Jews were not regarded by their Arab neighbors with hostility during the British Mandate, that the periodic massacres of Jews incited by Haji Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, reveals this to be false. The movie also tells viewers that unemployment increased during the Oslo peace process, Palestinian unemployment increased during the Oslo peace process, and that this increase was one of the contributing factors to the growing popularity of terror organizations like Hamas prior to the Second Intifada. In fact, unemployment in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank decreased during the early years of Oslo because of increased job opportunities in Israel. It was Hamas's suicide bombings and security measures they prompted that caused increases in Palestinian unemployment in 1996. But once the bombing stopped, Israel relaxed these security measures, and unemployment continued to drop until the beginning of the Second Intifada, when it went back up dramatically. So the movie got it exactly wrong. Palestinian violence caused Palestinian unemployment, not the other way around. The film also allows a Palestinian commentator to demonize Israeli voters for electing Benjamin Netanyahu as prime minister in 1996, asserting that his election proved that a majority of Israelis did not want peace. They desperately wanted peace, but they also wanted security to come along with it. Now, this narrator, or the source, does not mention, however, that scores of Israelis who were killed in suicide attacks helped Benjamin Netanyahu get elected in 96. And it was these, and any honest documentary would have acknowledged the roles that these attacks played in Benjamin Netanyahu's election. Even Netanyahu at War, which was recently broadcast by Frontline, acknowledged this reality, but Mark Green's movie did not. I could go on and on. And the thing is that this is, it's kind of odd for me, because basically Cam's bread and butter are factual misstatements. But the thing is that at a certain point we have to say there are just too many for us to get into at this point. And there are other problems with this movie that I need to talk to you about. And the thing is that if I listed every lie told in the little town of Bethlehem, I still wouldn't get at what's wrong with this movie. The film uses propagandistic reenactments to tell the story of Israeli Jews establishing a life for themselves at the expense of innocent Palestinians. And these reenactments downplay Palestinian hostility and violence towards Israel and Jews while highlighting Palestinian suffering at the hands of the Israelis. And emblematic of this is the footage that is broadcast in one of these reenactments. I'm going to, and it's Sandy Awa's segment. One of the most troubling things is their effort to basically do this kind of ignores the fact that when they try to misappropriate Martin Luther King, they basically ignore the fact that he himself was a Zionist. And he regularly affirmed Israel's right to exist and need for security, telling the National Convention of the Rabbinical Assembly in 1968 that peace for Israel means security, and that security must be a reality. And here's the full throat right on the screen. The movie's bias is so strong that something more than carelessness or ignorance on the part of the film's writer and director, Jim Hayden, is at play. Little Town of Bethlehem exhibits a hostile bias against the Jewish state and an undeniable attempt to propagandize against Israel and its supporters in the United States. And while we've learned or been told by a number of sources that Mark Green no longer supports the message offered by Little Town of Bethlehem, he is yet to publicly disavow himself from the movie, which can be still purchased at Amazon and which is still being promoted on Facebook. As we look at what is happening in Europe, where Jews are regularly attacked and in some instances killed because they are Jews, we must remember that virulent anti-Zionism, like what we see in the Little Town of Bethlehem, helped pave the way for this hostility. Given what's at stake, Mark Green needs to do more than privately admit that there were serious problems with this movie. He needs to apologize publicly, explain to people what happened, and embark on a campaign to correct the record. And this campaign would include the preparation of a distribution of a press release drawing attention to his efforts to correct the record. And the release would need to be sent to relevant media outlets, including Christianity Today, which gave the movie a positive review. And it would also include a fact sheet, basically saying this is how the movie got it wrong. Now, as I end my talk, I want to briefly draw your attention to the sexual assaults on women that took place in Europe over New Year's Eve. And this is not coming out of left field. They were perpetrated by Muslim radicals who have no respect for Western values of equality and dignity of women. And there are numerous reports of a concerted effort to keep the story of these attacks out of the media. And what do these attacks have to do with anti-Zionism? In a word, everything. The inability of European elites to respond appropriately and condemn and really forcefully respond to this problem is the result of a moral and intellectual failure that started with the embrace of anti-Zionism in Europe in the 1970s. Anti-Zionist activists trained, if you will, their neighbors to turn a blind eye to anti-Israel incitement, hostility, and violence that had been a problem in the Middle East for decades. As journalists, intellectuals, religious leaders, and politicians became desensitized to this violence, they lost the ability to identify and speak against the ideology of Islamism that motivated the attacks of New Year's Eve. All this is testimony to the importance of Cameron's work. In the globalized world we live in, the problems that have afflicted the Middle East for so long, the hostility towards Jews, the lack of respect for human rights, hostility towards religious freedom, and contempt for women are now making their way west through the internet and through immigration. The fact that we did not know how to speak about these problems as they existed in the Middle East is one of the reasons why we have such a difficult time speaking about them in Europe now. Western efforts to formulate a response to these problems has been hindered by the journalists, intellectuals, and religious leaders we counted on to inform us about the problems in the Middle East. One of the messages that Michael Oren, Israeli ambassador to the United States, has always said is, look, whatever problems exist in the Middle East, they're always coming west. That was in his most recent book, Ally. Okay, instead of telling us the truth about Islamism and jihadism and its impact on life in the Middle East, Western journalists, human rights activists, and religious leaders have encouraged us to view Israel as the problem and not the model in the region. And here is how I think Martin Niemöller would characterize the events of the past few years in Europe. I hope and pray that it doesn't turn out to be the same here. First they attacked Israel, but I didn't live in Israel, and I thought Israel kind of deserved it, so I didn't speak up. Then they attacked Jews in Europe, but I was not a Jew, and they claimed Israel as their homeland, so I did not speak up. Then they attacked Christians and Yazidis in Iraq and Syria, but I didn't live in Iraq and Syria, but I didn't speak up. Then they assaulted our wives, sisters, and daughters in Europe, but by then I had lost my voice. The people here in this room have not lost their voice. Because you spoke for Israel during its hour of need, you have maintained your integrity and the ability to speak boldly in defense of your communities. So in this time of trial, during which the very foundation of our moral and intellectual order are under assault, my message to you is a simple one. Be strong, let your heart take courage, and let not your foot be moved. Thank you.
The New English Review, and he is a regular contributor to the Gatestone Institute. He has written extensively on the Kairos Palestine document and has been documenting the anti-Zionist meetings. I cannot tell you how important this conference is. You know, this has been a vision of mine for many years to try to mobilize, as Trisha said, to get Christians to understand that this threat, anti-Semitism, is going to rear its ugly head again. And we saw this back in 2005 when we first started the organization, but even beforehand. We produced a documentary called The Forgotten People of Christianity and the Holocaust, where you'll have an opportunity to purchase a copy later on toward the end of the conference today, to see the history of Christian anti-Semitism and talk about, and we did discuss this potential threat, and here we are today. You know, we expect it from the mainline denominations, but we don't expect it from the evangelical church, because after all, aren't the evangelicals supposed to read their Bible? Aren't they supposed to know their Bible? Well, that's how I got into this. This is why I'm doing what I'm doing, because I've read the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation. And I'm so glad you brought up about the fact that there's 12 tribes. I've been my Christian friends. Did you read Revelation at the end of the chapter? Because guess what? The 12 tribes of Israel are going to be back in Jerusalem. As you enter into the gate, there is no Christian gate. Which tribe are you going to get behind? No, I haven't decided which one I'm going to be in, but I'm going to be there, I promise, with my Jewish brethren. I want to, again, thank Andrea and Trisha for this incredible opportunity and for hosting this conference. As Trisha said, our mission at PJTN is to educate Christians about their biblical responsibility to stand with our Jewish brethren and defend the state of Israel. We produce award-winning films in order to do this. And so as Dexter was making the case for PJTN, I don't know if he planned this, but as he was showing you the footage of the propaganda films that are being produced, we also knew that eventually somebody was going to try to produce films to counter our message. And sure enough, it happens to be Christians, unfortunately. Hitler in 1938 gave everybody in Germany a radio, and then he began his diatribe. Harry Truman understood the impact of media. And Harry believed that if he could just take over or broadcast on Radio Free Europe the
simple, unvarnished truth, he could educate the masses, and he was successful. That is why the work that CAMERA and PJPN are doing, and other organizations that are involved in fighting this issue for Israel in the media is so critically important. Because if we don't spread this message globally, the world is becoming smaller. We see anti-Semitism on the rise. If we don't stand up, if Jews and Christians do not unite together at this time and produce more films to educate the uninformed, we're going to be in trouble once again. And I didn't get involved in this mission for us to lose, because I know we win. So as Christian mentioned, we host an event every year at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention. It is our tour de force. We showcase all of our award-winning media to Christian broadcasters who come from around the globe, as many as 6,000 on any given year. And we give our films away. So all of our films and programs are privately funded, but we give them away to the Christian broadcasters with the agreement that they have to take our award-winning films and broadcast them to their audience. As a result of broadcasting not just the Forgotten People documentary, but Israel Indivisible, which is another one you'll have to get, because it is the definitive film where we make the case historically, archaeologically, legally, and biblically as to why Israel has rights to her ancient homeland. And of course, as a result of broadcasting those programs, we have people from 176 countries who visit our website. So I have the privilege and honor of also going on the radio and being Israel's biggest cheerleader. I do radio interviews, television interviews around the world. And we also screen our films in churches and synagogues across the country. Before I begin my remarks, I want to see a show of hands. Do we all feel like we're living in the latter days? Or in the time of redemption? We look at what's happening around the globe, and we stand befuddled at what's happening in the Middle East, in Europe, and now even here in the United States. We are living in challenging and sobering times in human history. And as I can see, many of us believe we are coming to a climax in history. If we look closely, we see a biblical warning that in the latter days that even the elect would be deceived. If we were warned that we must keep ourselves in sound and pure doctrine. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, there's a quote that says that in the last days difficult times will come, and many will turn away their ears from the truth and will turn aside to myths. Jesus warned his disciples, false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. I would say that it is, and the trend is alarming. In the scriptures, God made an everlasting covenant with the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. That covenant was confirmed in the Torah, the prophets, and the New Testament writings. How can we know that's true? As Christians, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, is the plumb line of our faith. The prophets and the New Testament writers must attest to these truths. If our understanding does not line up and then we are following false doctrines and traditions. The Bible is a book written to Israel, for Israel, and about Israel. Gentiles came into the commonwealth of Israel, as Paul stated in Ephesians 2, by their faith in Yeshua. It is extremely important that we understand this, because that is how we will perceive Israel and the Jewish people. The topic of this conference is to discuss the threats and challenges to this historic relationship between evangelical Christian support for Israel and the Jewish people. Today, I'll be focusing on the history of evangelical support, the threats that this relationship faces today, and how PJPN is countering those threats how each of us can help in this fight. Ladies and gentlemen, we are seeing a move of God which is unprecedented in history. Christians and Jews are uniting together in a growing relationship that the prophet Isaiah foretold, but it hasn't always been this way. To understand today, we must look at our anti-Semitic past and come to terms with it. Christian anti-Semitism can be traced back to the great divide between the two faiths during the reign of Constantine. Constantine's sword sliced away all remnants of the Hebrew roots and led to the birth of the church, the Catholic Church. Early church leaders soon led the cry of deicide against the Jews. The Jews as Christ killers still haunt our world today. From then, the Jewish-Christian relationship was lost and became horrific. During the Middle Ages in Europe, there was full-scale persecution in many places, with blood libel, expulsion, forced conversions, and massacres. Jews were banned from owning land and from pursuing a variety of professions. Persecution by the church in Spain and Portugal led to the infamous and brutal Inquisition. In 1516, the Republic of Venice decreed that Jews would be allowed to reside in a walled-in area of town called the ghetto. This requirement soon spread across Europe. The Jews became the scapegoats. Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia faced constant pogroms and persecution. The Tsar's chief advisor was reported as saying that 1/3 of Russia's Jews were expected to immigrate, 1/3 to accept baptism, and 1/3 to starve. The Reformation led by Martin Luther began in earnest. Luther had hoped that the Jews would accept Christ under his new Christian openness. When they rejected him, his writings turned to extreme anti-Semitism, some of which were later used by the Nazis. Thus, even Hitler's final solution had some basis in Christian anti-Semitism. The Nobel Prize writer and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel simply said that there were two types of people before the Second War: those who killed Jews and those who did nothing. We have to look back and wonder, how could a highly civilized, educated Christian nation turn its back on the horrific Holocaust genocide? In fact, how could most of the world do likewise? Is it any wonder that many Jewish people are skeptical of our Christian outreach to them? Still, throughout history, there were Christians who stood against the hate and helped protect and save Jews. There was a seed of Christian love and acceptance of the Jewish people. From such love also grew the seed to see a rebirth of Israel. We often think that the first Christian to push the establishment of the Jewish state was Lord Balfour. In 1917, as British Foreign Secretary, Lord Balfour wrote his landmark declaration to establish a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. But before Balfour, a deep-seated philosophical and religious movement had grown in British soil. The movement was called Christian Zionism. Even Napoleon, while camped in Palestine, issued a proclamation promising to restore Palestine to the Jews. It was an idea that grew. In England, there were many advocates. The most notable included John Nelson Darby, Lord Palmerston, Lord Manchester, Sir George Gawler, Lord Lindsay, and Lord Shaftesbury, who was the most active restoration lobbyist. He stated that he never had a shadow of doubt that the Jews were to return to their own land. It was his daily prayer and his daily hope. Oh, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, were the words engraved on the ring he always wore on his right hand. So clearly, Christian support for Israel is not a modern-day phenomenon. It is rooted in men who read and understood the Bible, that the Bible was about Israel, not the church. Yes, Christians played a major role in the establishment of Israel. They became instruments in fulfilling the words spoken through the prophet Isaiah, where it's quoted, "Before she was in labor, she gave birth, or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion was in labor, she gave birth to her children. Shall I bring to the time of birth and not cause delivery, says the Lord? Shall I, who caused delivery, shut up the womb, says your God?" And as they say, the rest is history. Even though the relationship between Christians, Jews, and Israel blossomed, the seed of the oldest hatred never died. With the birth of Israel, we've seen the rise of a new anti-Semitism, a hatred of Zionism, Israel, and the Jewish people all wrapped together. I suppose we would expect this from the secular world, but from Christians as well, and for that matter, even supposed Bible-believing evangelical Christians. Does history and hatred repeat itself? Get in land. It is really frightening to see that even more and more Christians and denominational networks are falling headlong into this treacherous heresy. Today, supposed Palestinian Christians and their allies include many respected evangelical leaders such as Bill and Lynn Hybels, who are founders of Willow Creek Church in Chicago. Willow Creek is one of the most influential evangelical churches. They influence young people, leaders, Christian leaders. They have congregants, as many as 25,000 congregants. They influence 80,000 leaders around the world. That's the reach they have. Lynn Hybels is one of the biggest proponents of the Christ at the Checkpoint. Pro-Palestinian activists like Shane Claiborne, who represents young evangelicals actively engaged in Christian social justice and activism. This is a very dangerous trend to be watching, because now they're reaching into the millennial generation with this propaganda. Another is World Vision, a highly respected and extremely influential organization in the evangelical Christian world. Tom Getman, a former activist with World Vision, recently admitted to his close affiliation with leaders of Hezbollah. That sounds like a Christian thing or relationship. World Vision's Middle East program in Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank has a staff of 140 people. And guess how much money? $16 million. That's their budget. We wonder why they're having tremendous inroads. You saw that film, little clips of that film with God on Our Side in little town of Bethlehem. I believe it was $10 to $20 million on those two films, on both of those films to produce. That's a lot of money to fund propaganda. Another glaring example of dangerous anti-Israel heresy being propagated on a very large scale is the annual conference, Christ at the Checkpoint, which we've heard about this morning. As Tricia mentioned earlier, Bethlehem Bible College also hosts its biannual anti-Semitic conference that promotes the same anti-Semitic false narrative that World Vision and Willow Creek espouse. The non-Jewish audience includes Christian clergy, Christian pastors, Christian students, Christian publishers, Christian authors, Christian Jews, Christian reporters, lots of Christians, and an Islamic spokesman for the Palestinian Authority's foreign minister, who kicked off the conference right after everybody stood to sing the Palestinian national anthem. One speaker, the Right Reverend Dr. Stephen Sizemore, espouses that God protected Hitler against assassination. Finally, I have to include Mark Green, as he's been mentioned this morning, who is the heir to the Hobby Lobby stores. We talked about boycotting. I boycott Hobby Lobby. In 2010, he was the executive producer of Little Town of Bethlehem, a documentary film that portrays Palestinians as peace-loving people trying to survive against a cruel Israeli government that is oppressing Arab Christians and Muslims. These organizations and conferences use a number of false narratives to target evangelical Christians, such as Jesus had more in common with the oppressed Palestinian people than the Jews, that the Jews are occupying Palestinian land, and the Jews have forfeited their covenant because of their rejection of Jesus. But what's the truth? What's actually happening on the ground in Israel? Well, let me just tell you a quick story about a tale of two cities. We were in Israel this past summer filming our next anti-BDS documentary, and we interviewed individuals from Bethlehem, and of course we've been to Bethlehem several times. We have a pastor friend who's there, and we're told that 80% or more of the Christians, the Why? Because there's a wall up and the Israeli government is oppressing them, right? The Israeli government does not oversee Bethlehem. I'm sorry, that's the Palestinian Authority. So how are they being persecuted and oppressed? Imagine that. Let's look at Nazareth. What, 50 miles north? Another community with a large Christian population. And we have Father Gabriel Nadav. Now keep in mind, Nazareth is under Israeli jurisdiction. Christians in Nazareth, got to tell you the secret, are prospering. In fact, we just saw Father Nadav, and he's building a new church. It's a bigger church. He only had a little tiny church that maybe 30 people could sit in. You should see, he's quadrupled the size in his new building. So don't let them tell you that the poor Christians are being oppressed. It's Father Gabriel Nadav that publicly is going out to Christian parents in Israel and telling them, you have to get your teenagers to enlist in the IDF because there is no safe place in the Middle East for Christians except in Israel. The crucial question today is what can we do to preserve this historic relationship for posterity for the sake of Israel and for the sake of the Jewish people, our Jewish brethren? How can we counter the new and dangerous threats to this relationship? Threats such as the BDS movement, for one. A new front in the war on Israel and those who support Israel is an insidious new form of anti-Semitism, cloaked in a false narrative about human rights for Palestinians. It promotes the smear that Israel is an apartheid country, an oppressor, an occupier. For those of you who are familiar with BDS, or not familiar with BDS, it stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. Thus, BDS groups call on the international community to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment initiatives against Israel, similar to those in apartheid South Africa. Proponents of BDS also called for pressure on governments to impose embargoes and sanctions toward Israel. This movement is now fueling the violent Israel apartheid demonstrations we're seeing on college campuses in the USA. And of course, California, here we are. You guys know about your issues with your university. BDS groups and proponents are pouring millions of dollars and organizational assets into influencing the millennial Christians so that the future of evangelicals' relations with Israel will be changed in favor of the Palestinian cause. TJPN is now on the front lines in the war to destroy the BDS movement and expose it, even the Christians that are involved in it. Here's what drives BDS is disinformation, lies that are spread through the media, through anti-Semitic groups, and even in school textbooks. Disinformation is the bread and butter of BDS. Their agenda of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and their ultimate goal, the elimination of the State of Israel. TJPN is combating BDS in a three-pronged fashion. Through a K-12 textbook initiative to change the lies that are being taught to our children in our high schools and middle schools. Through legislation that fights BDS on college campuses and halts illegal boycotts and divestments. And through the production of award-winning media aimed at the millennial generation. This follows with our campaign of biblical truth. In May of 2005, we began production of a feature-length documentary targeted millennial Christians to expose them to the lies and anti-Semitism of the BDS movement. The proposed film will be made in a style called docutainment, as it examines the false and ridiculous claims against Israel using satire and humor. We know that, like a great story, satire and humor can work as a Trojan horse and penetrate intellectual walls. Finding ways to work wit into a decidedly unpleasant subject matter can seriously challenge someone's view and cause them to re-examine what they believe to be the truth. Brad Stein, a popular college comedian and political commentator, will host the cinematic quest for truth. The plan for distribution includes a limited theatrical release that targets the millennial audience with screening on college campuses as well as theatrical showings in college towns. If this audience is not reached and taught the truth, the future of America's support for Israel could fade or evaporate completely. This is the next generation. We look at the propaganda being taught to our children in their textbooks. This propaganda has been going on for at least, that we know of, 12 years. That's one whole generation through the public school system that is hearing about Israel being an occupier, or is promoting quotes in textbooks that legitimize Palestinians blowing themselves up in a Jerusalem restaurant because they're waging a war against Israeli government policies and army actions. That's what our children are being fed in our public schools across this country. If this audience is not reached, we are in trouble. So what exactly is our Christian responsibility to Israel, to our Jewish brethren? God told the prophet Obadiah that in the latter days he was going to wipe out the descendants of Edom. The latter days, he's going to wipe out the descendants of Edom because they stood by while their brother Jacob, Israel, was held in captivity, and they did nothing. It starts by making a difference in our community. It starts by teaching our children the truth. We have to speak out and educate our community to stand against the anti-Semitism and replacement theology that is still pervasive in many segments of the Christian church. I invite you to get involved with PJTN and CAMRA to help us mobilize the global Christian community on behalf of our Jewish brethren and against Israel. You must contact our congressmen and senators when Israel's back is up against the wall. I want to just close with a couple of scriptures that I think are important to remind us, as I mentioned, Obadiah. God also told the prophet Joel in the latter days that he was going to wipe out the nations of the world because they were dividing up his land. Who's leading the charge? The United States of America, the Judeo Christian nation. How did this happen? If we look at what happened in Germany, Germany was a Christian nation too. It was educated. People say it can't happen here. Have you heard others in conversations say the same? We know from Germany that it can. It's time for Christian Zionists to stand on the authenticity of God's Word, to stand up against the false teachers who are promoting false doctrines and demand that they be removed from their positions of authority. The audacity that they have to suggest that we are idiots, and that's a quote, because we believe God's Word and His covenant to all Israel is outrageous. Having heard all this, I ask you once again, what is our biblical responsibility? Isaiah heard God from his throne say to the angels who were with him, "Whom shall I send, and who will go on our behalf?" And Isaiah's response was, "Here am I, send me." God bless all of you for being here, for being a word.
And our love is strong for Israel, and our support is unwavering. So count on us, the Latino community, and our whole goal is to go out there and to use all of our resources and all of our network of churches. There are many, many churches, and now we're going to Ethiopia as well, to be able to go out there and start influencing other people that know nothing about Israel, they're on the fence, to support them, eventually support them of Israel. And this song I'm going to sing is a song in Spanish, it's Psalm 121. And just 2 weeks ago we returned from Israel. The Jewish Federation San Diego sent I and my family and I to Israel. And I was able to sing with Israeli singer David Doer in concert. And so I sang this song as well in Jerusalem. It's called it's a Psalm 121. If you don't know Spanish, you can look at your Bible and read Psalm 121.
not rewrite it, not self-loathe about it, but to commit to change the trend so it doesn't repeat itself. And that's what we have endeavored to do. And so 10 years later, we just broke the threshold mark of 2.5 million members for the largest pro-Israel organization in the world. And I'm going to hijack a couple more minutes than I was allotted, mainly for two reasons. One of the questions was, what is Kupai doing? And it wasn't until I sat down and I told Trish, I'm going to start crying when I talk about this. When I cry, I don't cry like a little girl, I cry like a grown man. But it was when I was, I was in a Bible study, and I said to the guys, is this like Israel on CNN? And they said, no, wherever you see Israel, just pretend that it says the church there. And I was introduced to replacement theology, and I obviously didn't hook my wagon to that, or I probably wouldn't be up here talking to you right now. But the reality is I started watching and paying attention, and I took it so seriously that I developed workshops and presentations rebuking replacement theology and supersession theology. And but a friend, how many of you are from LA? How many of you know Elliot Brandt, the former one of the not many, an APAC leader? His mother recruited me and said, "Oh, great, you love Israel. You love Israel. What are you doing, for Israel? It's great that you're praying, but you're just getting up from your knees." And I thought there was a media bias. I didn't believe it was a conspiracy. I didn't believe there was media bias. I thought that was all conspiracy theory. She kept giving me camera magazines to read. And I thought, oh, yeah. So one day I'm reading the Sacramento Bee, and it says, I believe it was Joseph's tomb had been sacked. It was a little column on the inside by this scene. This is during the Oslo Accords, but the Jewish holy site was supposed to be protected in the Oslo Accords. And Jewish holy site was attacked by Palestinian militants. A couple days later, reading Sacramento Bee. Palestinian militants declared Joseph's tomb a Muslim holy site, declared that it was originally a mosque. Okay. A couple days later, reading Sacramento Bee. IDF tries to retake its holy site. What is the big bold title site? Israel attacks Muslim holy site. And that's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and that's when I decided to shift gears from just standing for, praying for Israel to getting involved in political advocacy as well. And took those workshops up a notch. Pastor APAC recruited us to bring their message to the Christian audience. We were at the APAC Policy Conference when Pastor John Hickey was there, and he met us, recruited us, he gave us his message, Jesus loves you, and I have an excellent plan for your life. And so, we've been running to keep up with it ever since. And so, the answer to the question, what does CUFI do? We do 40 to 50 pro-Israel events in churches all across the nation every single month. And our purpose is to mobilize the complacent and to inoculate everybody in the room against the narrative that we're here for today. One of the most important things that we do is Kupai campus. The MSA has about 150 chapters on campuses across this country. We've got 135 chapters on campuses across this country. If you want to get a sense of the caliber of leaders that we have, take a look at Josh Hoyt over there. He's the former academic director for the Israeli Consulate General, and he is a Kupai campus alumni. So thank you very much, Josh, for your service. That's probably the most important thing that we do. We do BDS boot camps, 4 of them a year all across the country, where we just an intense immersion where they do mock votes, and so when those students come out of those, they go back to their student government, and they're in familiar territory, and they don't lose their nerve. Probably the most important thing that we do is our flagship, our Washington, D.C. summit every single year. I'm going to show you a short clip. You're going to get a glimpse of that in just a moment, where we bring about 5,000 Christians every single year to Capitol Hill and send the message. It's not just your Jewish constituents that want you to support strong U.S.-Israel relations, and we're getting their attention. The first year they didn't know we were coming. Second year they were hoping that we wouldn't come back. Third year they realized we weren't going to go away, and now we have their attention. And as far as, I have to say, Lori Curtis, that was I'm very inspired by what you're doing, and I will echo, we're all on the same page. We are just now releasing our first book, Israel for Critical Thinkers, our first documentary, Israel Through the Looking Glass, and our first weekly television program on TVN, The Watchman, with Eric Stackelbeck. So we're going to do what we can to on, I want you to do me a favor, I want you to write this down, because we do short films through our millennial outreach called the Israel Collective. Write down Israel Collective. It's not going to ask you for money, it's not going to ask you to join. It's just going to let you see a number of short films that will inspire you and encourage you. Our film on the heart of Israel was cited by the Ministry of Tourism as the most valuable resource available to show the true nature of Israel. And our short film on apartheid, by actually interviewing black South Africans in South Africa, we were just asked by the consulate's office for Jordan to translate it into Arabic for them. So we're getting some traction, and I'm going to show you this real quick, and then I'm going to come up and tack on a closure, and then I'm going to hand it over to whoever's going to introduce our fabulous keynote speaker, Mr. David Susan, in just a moment. So here's an overview on See You About It.
Can I help you, Father? He says, well, you know, dear Rabbi, we've had a big problem in our neighborhood recently with break-ins, and I wanted to ask you, how come all the Jewish homes don't get broken into? So the rabbi, of course, points to the mezuzah on the wall. He says, Father, the Jews have this special tradition where we put this little prayer scroll on the wall, and that way God, the Almighty, protects us. So the priest says, wow, that's wonderful. Can I have one? And the rabbi says, of course. So he helps him put a mezuzah on his door. A couple of weeks later, in the middle of the night, somebody bangs on the door of the rabbi. He wakes up in a panic, and he doesn't know who it is. So he opens the door just a little bit. He says, excuse me, it's the priest. So the rabbi says, what happened? Was your house not protected? He says, we got even worse. We got fundraisers. But protection. We're here today with a lot of human mezuzahs who are protecting Israel. When I look at camera, I see a mezuzah that's helping protect Israel. And QFI and Lori's organization, and my friend Adam Milstein from IAC, all the fighters in the Stand With Us group, they're mezuzahs to protect Israel. Because when we use the gifts that God gave us, that's how we express our godliness. Because we don't just depend on God to protect Israel. I want to thank, first of all, Andrea and Tricia for inviting me. I want to thank Talia Gold, who 7 years ago bought me coffee at Coffee Bean and convinced me to be involved with Cameron. I've been involved ever since. And I want to thank all of you for showing up. I have to confess, I've had a very nerve-wracking morning because I wrote my remarks last night, and then I thought, well, should I just come for my speech? And I said, you know, it might be smart for me to just come for the whole thing. That way, I'll see if they're already going to tell you everything I'm going to tell you. And the reason I was nervous is because I said to myself, what happens if all the speakers tell you what I'm already going to tell you? So I would have to improvise. So the good news is, I think I have something new. That's the good news. And I will tell you, when we ran the ad in the Jewish Journal, whoever wrote the headline is brilliant. Because I got so many comments from people coming and said, first, if you didn't see the ad, it was a Christian assault on evangelical support, or Christian support for evangelical support for Israel. And the word assault, people were saying, what does that mean? We thought we had huge support in the Christian community, because that is the stereotype right now, and that is the conventional wisdom. And it makes sense. When 99.9% of all the terrorist attacks are from one religion, somehow we don't feel we need to worry about the Christians. When we do worry about the Christians, we worry that they might convert us. But the conventional wisdom has been, and I think part of it is thanks to QFI and so much of the work that you've done, the conventional wisdom is we don't have a problem with the Christians. There's hundreds of millions of them. They love Israel. So the genius of this convention today is that you're sort of adding something new to the conversation that we in Los Angeles did not realize, that there's a real issue within the evangelical movement. and it's not something that we can take for granted. So when I did a little bit of homework, I noticed the former leader of QFI, his name is David Grover. And last year, he wrote a phenomenal piece. It was a long, long essay speaking precisely to this looming threat. And if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read one paragraph of his essay. The situation is changing dramatically. With every passing month, more evidence is emerging that these anti-Israel Christians are succeeding in reaching beyond the evangelical left and are influencing the mainstream. In particular, they're penetrating the evangelical world at its soft underbelly, the millennial generation. These young believers, ages 18 to 30, are rebelling against what they perceive as the excessive biblical literalism and political conservatism of their parents. As they strive with a renewed vigor to imitate Jesus and with the oppressed and the downtrodden, they want to decide for themselves which party is being oppressed in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Notice the language. Which party is being oppressed? This is really, really bad news for the Jews, and it's bad news for Israel. And it shouldn't surprise us, because the religion in America today is the religion that's called I am a victim. You've all read about microaggressions, trigger warnings. You all read about the affluent students who are offended and demonstrate because an email about uniforms during Halloween they found really aggressive, and it created an unsafe space. We have become a nation of victims. If you want to be popular today, you've got to be a victim. With this new millennial generation, they won't like you if you're convinced them that you're really oppressed and that you're really a victim. This is a major problem for the Jews. And it's a major problem for Israel, and it's a major problem for America. America was not built as a victim country. The Judeo-Christian ethic that we speak so often about comes very much from a respect for the Old Testament. This country never abandoned the Old Testament. When you hear about the Protestant work ethic, this idea of taking responsibility, of being resourceful, that's the Judeo-Christian work ethic. You look at Europe, where's the Old Testament in Europe? That worships the victim, the oppressed, the downtrodden, the underdogs. It's not a coincidence that there's such love and sympathy for Palestinians in Europe, and that there's such love and sympathy for Israel in America, because we are not a victim country. I'm a Jewish refugee. I'm one of 800,000 refugees from Arab countries. A few weeks ago, I was invited to speak at the United Nations because they had a thing called the forgotten refugees. And the idea is that the Palestinians have owned this narrative, that they're the refugees. Meanwhile, me and 800,000 other Arab Jews have been forgotten. So I was the last speaker, and everybody got up to speak, and we need justice for our Sephardic Jews. Their story needs to be told. They are victims too, and the truth is, we were victims. We were dhimmis. We were speaking about dhimmi today. We were second-class citizens for centuries. We were victims. When we left Morocco, some of us went to Canada, some of us went to Israel, and some went to France. My grandfather went to Israel. He had a great business in Casablanca. He ended up in a tiny little place near Ashkelon where 7 kids were sleeping in one room. We all know there was a lot of discrimination against Sephardic Jews in Israel. And he never complained once, because he came home. Because 5 times a day, he was praying to return to Jerusalem, in Morocco, in his successful business. He was yearning to return home to Jerusalem after 1900 years. So he didn't look at the suffering. He came home. My parents were in a tiny apartment in Montreal, Canada. Went from 80-degree weather in Casablanca to -20 in Montreal. My mother would take 4 buses to make $50 a week as a seamstress and take extra buses Thursday night because they have the kosher places open late, and she can get the food for Shabbat. And my father's record of teaching was not accepted, so he had to take night school for 10 years and so forth, right? And we get kicked out of apartments because I made too much noise. That's a lot of reasons to complain. My poor parents. Did we complain? Did my parents ever make me feel like a victim? Not once. When we got together at our Shabbat table, we were grateful to be Jews. We were grateful that we were now in a place where they had great universities, which they didn't have in Morocco. And this is what I said at the United Nations. I never once knew what it was to be a victim. So the reason the media has not made a big deal about the Arab Jews, like me, all 800,000 of us, is because we didn't really make that big a deal of it. We didn't have detention camps that we would use for public relation purposes. There was an Ashkenazi organization called the JUDEO, and they raised millions of dollars to send to my family and my Arab Jewish brethren to help us out. We took care of our own. That's why it was not a big story. If any people in the world has earned the right to wallow in victimhood, it is the people who lost 6 million. And yet, what did we do? Did we wallow in victimhood? Or did we take that little postage stamp that the United Nations gave us and build the greatest country of the 20th century? You could never accomplish what Israel has accomplished with a feeling of victimhood. So this is now our trap. Here we are, powerful, successful, in a world where powerful and successful is really unpopular. Here we are in a world where the popular ones who have sympathy are the oppressed and the victims, and we refuse to be oppressed and to be victims. What do you do about that? It's a real, genuine problem. So, I understand that we did a lot of theology today. We did some politics. We did some anti-Semitism. I'm not going to get into those things. Theology is the soul. Politics is the mind. I want to talk to you about the heart. Because thank God, having been in the ad business for 25 years, one of the things you learn is you never say no. No matter which client comes in, there's always an interesting idea that you can come up with. We don't give up. So now you have a conundrum. You have a world where the only way to be popular, pretty much, is to be an oppressed victim. And then you have a country who's the exact opposite of an oppressed victim. Israel, who's the epitome of success. How do you reconcile these two? How do you reconcile these two? I can tell you right off, there is no way we're going to take up door number one. We are not going to allow ourselves to get killed to earn the sympathy of the world. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And I can also tell you, we are certainly not going to slow down Startup Nation. We're not going to slow down the miraculous contributions we make to humanity and the incredible success and the fact that we're some of the happiest people in the world. Like, when I say Israel, I mean we. Right there in Israel. We're not going to do that. So what do? How do we create some content, a conversation, a dialogue that can show? But in terms of the narrative of the heart, that is what we need to work on. The narrative of the heart. So I want to share a little story with you. I was in the Knesset on this anti-BDS conference, and this Michael Lauren was sitting next to me. And it was really interesting. Everybody was giving their own different point of view. And right before I spoke, he spoke. And he said, I just came out of a conference where, even though an hour away from here, there's an organization called ISIS, that's chopping heads off. I just came out of a conference where you know what the discussion was about? How do we increase student sensitivity to transgender? Think about that. Think about how far this country goes, right? I come from an old school Sephardic world. I'm not going to be pro-transgender necessarily. I mean, I'm a little old school, but I respect it. We had a cover on a Jewish journal. Transgender, it's part of our reality. It's part of the reality of Israel. And here is a country that's surrounded by 150,000 rockets, a country that's under existential threat, that finds the time to dig so deep into human rights that it teaches its kids sensitivity to the transgender community. Think about that. Just think about it, whether you're pro or against, regardless of your ideology. And it made me think that Israel has the best-kept secret. The thing that people don't know about Israel is the incredible amount of Jesus activity, of compassion that goes on in Israel. Think about that, all right? I spoke to someone that we all know, we send his regards. His name is Gerald Steinberg, who runs this incredible organization called NGO Monitor, and basically they monitor all the NGOs and nonprofits in Israel. A lot of them are anti-Israel, a lot of them do damage, but it's okay, they have the right to do so. They're nonprofits. And I asked him the other day, Gerald, please estimate how many nonprofit groups in Israel. He said about 40,000. Think about that. A little tiny, tiny country the size of Delaware has 40,000 nonprofit charities, NGOs. And what do? They fight for the rights of minorities. They fight for the rights of the handicapped. They fight for the rights of Arabs. They fight for the rights of Bedouins. They fight for women's rights. I want to know all this because I've been doing my research for the past 2 years. My daughter started a thing called Tikkun Olam Journey, and as a lot of you might know, in the Jewish world, the new religion is called Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, right? And it turns out that this new religion of the liberal world, this new religion of the millennials that David Brooks spoke about, their new religion is repairing the world. It's called Tikkun Olam. And it turns out that Israel has more Tikkun Olam going on per capita than any country in the world. You know? Now, a lot of times we look at these things as a negative because it really upsets us, drives us nuts, creates anger. There's an organization that's going to demonstrate against Israel right inside of Israel. But that's not what the whole picture is about. There's an enormous amount, every morning, social activists, Israelis, who get up in the morning to try to make Israel a better place. By the tens of thousands. They don't sell their high-tech startups for $1 billion. They're not in Silicon Valley. They're not the high-profile Israelis. They're the silent Israelis. The ones who open up restaurants for the blind. The ones who have restaurants where all the waiters are ex-convicts. The ones who have a new technology so they can help a crippled child, where they will adapt an iPad so that that crippled child is now able to discover color and music and shapes. Where they will find a new way of doing a wheelchair. Where they will create a new therapy, where horses now become a therapy for handicapped children. Where art becomes a place of healing. There are thousands and thousands of social justice organizations all throughout Israel that we never hear about. And I'll tell you something, if Jesus was alive today, he would love Israel. He would love Israel. Because really, all of Israel is not a victim country. Israel specializes in taking care of victims. So when I set up that conundrum a few minutes ago, when I said the only way to succeed is to be a victim in terms of public relations, in terms of public sympathy, and yet it's something we could never be. How do you resolve that conundrum? The only way to resolve it is to open up our hearts and to show the Israel of the heart. You don't have to be a victim to take care of victims. In fact, the very strength of Israel is its ability to take care of victims. So this is my blessing today. This is my blessing. My blessing is that we open up this new Israel of the heart to the millennial generation. I would love to see every church in America hear about this other Israel, this compassionate Israel, this Israel of the heart, this human Israel. I would love it. And you know, a lot of times people say, oh yeah, it's true, David, we went to Haiti first, and it's true, we went to Japan, that's true, and we always go, we have these humanitarian missions. They say, no, stop. I'm talking in the Holy Land. I'm talking about social justice right there in Israel. Christian groups, college groups, millennials need to go visit the Israel of the light. They need to see the compassionate Israel. That compassionate Israel is the only Israel that this new millennial generation can identify with. It's the Israel that has their values. It's an Israel that Jesus would love, and it's an Israel that God would love.
And I, of course, belong to the Aramaic people, the Aramaic nation, people who used to live in this region before the Arab conquest to the Middle East in the 7th century. The relation of the Middle East, like Aramaic presence, which we call Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and include the Galilee, actually, had an Aramaic population who used to the land of Aram, and looking around it, and Europe. And Europe, they don't dare to speak as Christians, I'm telling you. And we in Israel are proud being Israeli and act freely and speak loudly. And you will see that in images. Who we are, the Aramaic people. The Aramaic people are the descendants of the early Christians of the Middle East, which used to inhabit region before the Islamic conquest in the 7th century. After Islamic conquest, as you know, we use this definition a lot, dhimmis. Most of them went into dhimmis, and some of them got Islamized or submit to Islam, and the rest stayed Christians like us, using the Aramaic language and speaking on it, and from these people developed so many different churches in the Middle East. We have like 5 basics of them surrounding Antioch. Antioch was a very central, let's call it a city at that time of Jesus' time, and later on, like Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, Rome, and Alexandria, 5 important cities. And around Antioch, we have 5 churches almost that were created. One of them is my church, which is the Syrian Maronite Church of Antioch. And it is a church that is based in Lebanon today and spread in Syria a little bit and in northern Israel. But we, like all other Christians, we have no differences there. We feel to each other as Christians, as brothers in Christ, like I feel to you now. This is how we treat each other. We don't have this definition, oh, he's a Maronite, he's a Greek Orthodox, he's a Greek Catholic, he's evangelist, we all brothers in Christ, and our Jewish brothers are the older brothers. And let me remind you, the Pope mentioned that yesterday in the synagogue in Rome. He said the Jews are our older brothers, and they didn't crucify Jesus. They didn't kill Jesus. This is the Pope. So if we believe in this Pope, as Christians in the Middle East, and specifically these guys that are in charge of the BDS movement from Bethlehem, they should listen to the Pope. This is what they should do, but they're not doing it because they have different agenda. nothing else. So, it's time is starting. Anyway, here, I'm going to show you some, first of all, my organization. I'm heading an Aramaic Christian organization. We have 4 goals. First goal is recruitment, education, employment, and integration. We want to integrate fully into the Israeli society. How we do that? First of all, in recruitment to the IDF. Why IDF? IDF is the military force that protects our country, our borders, to keep it safe. We have ISIS in the borders of the Golan Heights, 1 hour or half an hour from our homes. And if we didn't have these IDF forces, they would keep us from our homes and confiscate our land like they did in Mosul, in Iraq lately, and in Syria. And we will have no home, and our ladies will be sold in ISIS market in Syria and the West. And the world will look and keep silent. And nobody say anything. This is actually what is the IDF. IDF is actually the midpoint, the school for Israelites. If you want to be an Israeli and fully integrated, the IDF is the address for this Israelite. So, education. We are in charge for Aramaic studies. Aramaic is actually something that unites us with the Jews, not only by spiritual, but also ethnically. Let me remind you, the fathers and the mothers of the Jews. Who were the fathers and the mothers of the Jews? Who is Abraham? Who is Isaac? Who is Jacob? Who is Rachel and Leah and Sarah and even Rebecca? All from Aramaic family in Aram Naharaim. Aram Naharaim, which is today the border between Iraq and Syria. These were Arameans who came all the way down by God's order and settled on the land that God promised him, for him and his descendants. And today, we are Christians after being, not all the Arameans just or went after Abraham. Some of them stayed pagan until Jesus came, the Messiah, and all followed him and his way and become one again under Jesus. So the Jews, my nation as well, the Jews are not strange to me. As Eastern Christian, and this is not my word, this is my patriarch word in 1937, when the Jews were persecuted in the Middle East and in Europe, the pogroms in Europe, and persecutions I don't call it even Palestine, I call it the land of Israel. And in Syria and Iraq, we were the ones who stand up for the Jews. Our patriarch went to the synagogue in Beirut in 1937 and told the Jews to come to Lebanon and open the borders for them to save them from the Holocaust in the Second World War. And this is all, we will see later, you can find it in the Zionist archive in Jerusalem. All these documents are there. I'm not bringing up nothing from my head. So, this is just for you to know that we save and help many lives, Jewish lives, in order to stay together and to protect each other and stay alive and create a Jewish homeland. This was our recommendation in 1947. Just to let you know, in 1947 there was UN Scope Committee, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, they call it. We were the ones who gave recommendations, me and others who sided with the Jews and with Israel, because we want to integrate Christians to the IDF and to the country. They do conference against us, they send threats against us. Look at this demonstration of Islamic movement and Palestinian movement inside Israel. They are allowed, my friends. This is what they do in Israel, in Nazareth. This is the democracy of Israel. This is what it is. Don't hear the story they tell you Israel is hurting the Arabs and discriminating, or they live in fear. cheating you. They put fences around churches, and they dress like soldiers, Israeli soldiers, in order to come to you to the west and take these pictures and show you, look, Israel, how they put fences around the church in Nazareth. And this is Muslim demonstration, my friends. This is not Jewish. So, just be aware of this fact. If you want to know more about Christians in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Bethlehem, go to please YouTube and write YouTube Christians in Gaza, persecuted, and you will find so many links about this issue. Look about how sarcastic this Atala Hanna Bishop, using a symbol, a very symbolic, which is the Christmas tree, and acting as a dhimmi. This is dhimmi attitude. To someone who wants to know, this is dhimmi. He's siding with the Islamic fanatics, like this guy, Sheikh, that he in the day of New Year, burned the cars of Christians because celebrating a New Year, my friends. They didn't allow them to celebrate New Year in Bethlehem. And this is the same guy, you see him near this bishop. And he's standing with him in order to pray this service again. This is the Dhimmi attitude you don't know about. Look how they preach to kill Jews. We teach for tolerance in Israel. Our media talk about tolerance. And our schools, and they talk about how to stab Jews. Look, I'm not going to continue more because I know I have...
And they and their descendants would be his people. There were other covenants made with Noah, with Moses, and with David. But all of those covenants depended on the basic covenant made with Abraham and his wife. Now, Jesus speaks of the blood of the covenant in Matthew 26 and Mark 14. And Paul suggests that the covenants of promise, covenants plural, go back to a covenant, which God granted to Abraham through the promise. And that's Ephesians 2 and Galatians 3. Now, some of the other covenants were conditional, while this basic Abrahamic covenant was unconditional. So, for example, the Mosaic covenant God made with the Jewish children of Abraham promised blessings for obedience to its terms and punishments for disobedience. Deuteronomy 28. One of the blessings, as we shall see, was control of the land. Exile from the land was also one of the punishments. Now, many Christians wonder, why does God spend so much time on the story of Israel in what Christians call the Old Testament? And why does this make up 3/4 of the Christian Bible? Well, what about the rest of the world? Now, the New Testament contains a mission to the nations in the Great Commission, Matthew 28. But is there anything like this in the First Testament? Now, I'll say other than the first 11 chapters of Genesis that describe the creation in the first civilizations? Why is so much space devoted to the story of Abraham and his family when they were such a tiny part of the rest of the world? One of my aha moments was the day I started to see that there was a pattern to the biblical story in both testaments. The pattern moves from the particular to the universal. God uses the particular, a particular person or a particular people, to bring blessing to the universal, the world. Now, in the First Testament, God uses a particular man, Abraham, and his people, the Jews, to bring blessing to their neighbors, and through those neighbors, to the world, the universal. And the pattern is the same in the Second Testament. God uses a particular man, Jesus, and his people, Jesus' body, the church, to bring blessings to the world. The ahas kept building as I saw this pattern in the First Testament. It starts in Genesis 12, where God calls Abraham to go to a land that I will show you. And from there, God promised to make of him a great nation, and that through him, all the families of the earth would be blessed. Now, this promise is repeated 4 more times just in Genesis. Just before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, God declares, Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. gain blessing for themselves. Dream of a ladder reaching up to heaven, God tells them, you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and the north and the south, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Combined both in the classical Protestant churches and in the evangelical churches. And in fact, when I listened today to the wonderful, wonderful lecture that we were given by David Switzer about Visit Israel of the Heart, I thought, what should I speak about now? This is exactly the message that I would like to give to you, because Visit Israel of the Heart, that is what we all have to work on. But in order to be able to come to Israel and to see Israel of the heart, we need to have a leadership that brings, in fact, the faithful ones to Israel. And today we have a leadership that is not doing it. And that is why I would like to ask the question, how come that the leadership, the Christian leadership, faithful leadership, is not there any longer today in many ways to bring the faithful ones to Israel, to see the Israel of the heart. And I made an analysis, and I have here a handout of what I'm going to say, which is very kindly published, copied by Tricia and others. And that gives me also a moment to say thank you to Camera, and to the Levines, and to Tricia, and to Dexter, wonderful friends for many, many years, and without them we probably would not have survived the last few years, because we felt quite desperately alone in Jerusalem, working. But here I can see it was wrong, because there are so many underground millions of Christians working for Israel. Great news. But let's go a little bit into the analysis and see what happened. After normally the order in the church is the hierarchy leads the faithful. But what happened is that due to the massive failure of the European church hierarchy at the Shoah, it was in fact the faithful who started to encourage the church leadership and to take over leadership. And they were encouraged to do so by Jewish friends like Julie Dark, Elie Wiesel, Yehuda Ashkenazi, David Flusser, who was mentioned before, great Rabbi Peter Liggins, and many others. And they helped us, the faithful ones in the churches, to take leadership just against all odds, and to lead the church to new roots, to reclaim the Jewish roots of Christian theology. And in fact, we did so. The faithful claimed the Tutsi connected to church superstructure, such as the World Council of Churches, which was already mentioned today. And the World Council of Churches promoted new political sessions. Amongst the most significant trends in the 1970s was the Arab-European rapprochement between Western and Muslim countries, characterized by Judeophobia and Islamophobia, that is the fear of Jews and the love of Islam. Arab-European policy went in tandem with reactionary theology. Trendy Protestant hierarchs embraced Palestinian replacement theology and hijacked Jewish-Christian relations by handing over to this whole relationship between Christians and Jews to Palestinian replacement theologically inclined clergy. That is, those clergy who were with their heart for the fostering the relationship with Israel, they were precisely squeezed out, and all the jobs and everything was given to those pro-Palestinianists. And the faithful ones were slowly robbed of their goods. The tool, the Palestinian replacement tool. The Palestinian replacement tool became the religious cultural link to the West for the Euro-Arab political economic bloc.
In 1977, there was a very important conference in Italy, in Venice, and there, this conference recommended the strategy of implementation of religious cultural connections between the member states of the European Community and the League of Arab States. In 1983, there was a follow-up conference in Hamburg, in Germany, and there the Arab delegates reminded their European colleagues of the duty to recognize and teach at university level the greatness and superiority of Islamic civilization and of the Islamic religion. Religious scholars affirm the Islamic origin of Judaism, Christianity, and all mankind. Chief PRT, Palestinian replacement theologian, Naim Atik, responded with fitting versions of supersession. And he wrote this doctoral thesis precisely on that subject, and that is justice and only justice. And through this, the replacement theology was made fashionable. The Palestinian replacement theology was in line with another organization, or another conference in Lahore in 1974, which as a summit of the organization of the Islamic Conference, they came together, and this is where Secretary General Isa Homi commended the churches in the Arab countries and worldwide on behalf of the Palestinians and praised their backing of Arab sovereignty over Jerusalem. His address conformed to the Quranic dogma of Islam's precedence over Judaism and Christianity. So trendy Protestant hierarchs followed suit and promoted PRT, Palestinian Replacement Theology. And our friend, Malcolm already mentioned Batya Or, has researched this very, very carefully, and we have learned lots and lots about the reality or the background of these important findings from her. There's a third point in the PRT are their three prerogatives. The supersessionism of PRT rests on three prerogatives: rewriting history, dualism, and Gnosticism. Rewriting history means history starts and ends with Islam, Palestinianism, and very often when you read Naim Atik's writings and other writings of PRT ideologues, you cannot make a distinction between Islam and Palestinianism. So history starts and ends with Islam stroke Palestinianism. Judaism and Christianity are based on Islam. No Jewish temple existed. Jesus was a Palestinian. The land of Israel is Palestine. This is, in short, the rewriting of history. The second point you find in PRT is dualism. And it is that a bright and moral side is presented by Islam stroke Palestinianism. A dark and immoral side is presented by Judaism. Judaism steals land, kills children, poisons wealth, and corrupts the international community. Christianity, also dark, of course, but, however, can improve when, by proxy, punishes Israel, for example, through BDS. The third point is Gnosticism. It's another point in the PRT too. It is, Gnosticism means enhancing knowledge, meaning what appears is not true, the hidden is the real thing, and the real thing is not real. Therefore, Isaac is replaced by Ishmael. Judas, not Jesus, was crucified. The text of the Bible is faulty in Judaism and Christianity, and of course it is superior in Islam stroke Palestinianism. So such anti-Judaism and anti-Christianity was promoted and is promoted and enforced by well-financed church structures. And basically these 3 points that I just mentioned are the very tools of PRT. At that betrayal, faithful joined forces with evangelical leaders in the 1980s, 90s. And now, I come to my second point, the contest between the evangelical leaders and the faithful on the one side, and the PRT on the other side.
In the 80s and 90s, the evangelical leaders of the faithful exposed anti-biblical PRT hierarchs, and they supported Israel. The combination of anti-replacement theology and pro-Israel attitude nurtured the West's pro-Israel will and constituted a formidable threat to the political concept of the Western Arab alignment. That impact had to be stopped. You understand? Again, it was a leadership that wanted to work against the church hierarchy that was anti-Israel. So, who has to stop now this kind of danger to the policy of Western Arab alignment? This task was given to the politically savvy PRT activists. PRT took two measures for hijacking the evangelical leaders and the faithful ones' efforts. 2 points. Teaching of contempt and flattery of the evangelical leaders and the faithful leaders. PRT retaliation, number 1. First of all, establishing 2 charges against the evangelical leaders and the faithful ones by employing, first of all, by employing 2 main charges. First of all, evangelical leaders were to be ridiculed for allegedly unsophisticated reading of the Bible and condemned for translating it into support for Israel. How stupid these people are and how uneducated. That is the one line that they take. The other one is the evangelical leaders' unconditional love for Israel was juxtaposed with Israel's alleged apartheid system. These charges and incentives for the impressed produced PRT allies amongst the evangelicals and the faithful and sidelined the others. The same PRT trick used 2 decades earlier with the church hierarchs, and it worked well then. It seems to work well now as well. So the mix of ridiculing, belittling, and denigrating pro-Israel Christians worked also this time well amongst Christians and Jews alike. PRT retaliation number 2. 3 kinds of adversaries developed out of these 2 main charges. That is, there were adversaries from Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, for political reasons, from secular Jews for political reasons, and from religious Jews for mission issues. These adversaries cooperated with PRT representatives against
having a great opportunity to stand at the feet of some tremendous Jewish scholars like Professor David Frutzen, my colleague, my good friend, Malcolm Mould mentioned earlier, and just see how we as Christians need to learn from the Jewish community. Today I'm going to be sharing with you in 3 parts. Part 1 is Jesus and ethical monotheism. Part 2 is the Apostle Paul and ethical monotheism. And part 3 is Israel and the church, replacement or engraftment. And the theme that I'm going to pursue in each one of these is to look at the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and the faith of Israel. Very famous Protestant seminary professor wrote a very important commentary on Romans, would start his class by saying, the first thing you must do to be a good Christian is to kill the Jew inside of you. One of his students raised her hand and said, Professor, do you mean Jesus? Recently, Reverend Jeremiah Wright of the Church of Christ, the pastor in Chicago, proclaimed, Jesus is a Palestinian. And he has been known to preach and proclaim, the Jews killed my Jesus. What about
to share with you a famous quotation of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said, "The vital issue in the church is to decide to look for its roots in Judaism. Either you can look for your roots in Judaism and consider itself an extension of Judaism, or to consider itself as an antithesis to Judaism by looking for its roots in Hellenism." I'd like to cite my good friend, great scholar, Dr. Marvin Wilson, who wrote the best-selling book, Our Father Abraham, who said that if in Germany there had been a knowledge of the Jewish roots of the faith of Christianity, the Holocaust would have been impossible. Well, today we will be examining the Jewish roots of Christianity by studying the teachings of Jesus and Paul concerning these key foundational points, that is, the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and the faith of Israel. They asked Jesus, "What is the foremost commandment?" He answered by saying, "Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad." If we start with the faith of Israel, he stressed the knowledge of God, the understanding of God. The second is likened to it, love thy neighbor as thyself. I think when he met with what we sometimes call the Canaanite woman in the Gospel of Matthew, we also know her as the Syrophoenician woman, who came to him asking Jesus to heal her daughter. And, Jesus said something pretty shocking. I know there's a couple of those words you're never supposed to say to your wife, your daughter, or any other woman. One of them would begin with a D. One of them would be that D word, you shouldn't ever see. But what did Jesus say? Well, the dogs shouldn't eat the crumbs from the children's table. This is very shocking to hear from everything we know about Jesus in the Gospels. What did the Canaanite woman respond? She said, well, even the dogs should eat those crumbs. What did the woman really say? What was really going on? I think that this rabbi, this teacher, someone who promoted ethical monotheism, someone who brought Judaism to the world, was challenging this social value system, this Canaanite religion, religions of many gods. And when he actually made the shocking statement, what was she saying? She was saying, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. I believe in the one true God of Israel. And Jesus told her, you have great faith. And her daughter was healed. I think that if we start reading the Gospels through Jewish eyes, we have to see the deep connection to ethical monotheism. Pope John Paul said in 1980, whoever meets Jesus meets Judaism. Think that when Pope John the 23rd saw those Holocaust films and he actually said, Corpus Christi, the body of Christ. Oh, words from the Eucharist in recognizing the suffering of Jesus' family in the Holocaust. 50 years after those great taught it, with the Catholic Church doing complete transformation by saying we cannot hold the Jewish people historically accountable for the death of Christ. We have a Chicago minister, and many in the Christian world today saying, well, Jesus was a Palestinian, and look at how the Israelis are treating the Palestinians, and you know the Jews killed Jesus, look at what's happening to the Palestinians. And we don't hear the good story that if you're a Christian in the Middle East, the only place you're safe is in Israel. Do you want Hamas, the coalition between the PLO, Assad, the Fatah, and Hamas to be protecting Christians? Well, I'd like to suggest today that if we really look at Jesus, that he's really Jewish. And one of my biggest struggles, I think, when I look at Jesus is that we get so excited as Christians about the Christ he did. He died on the cross. This is so important. He died on the cross as Christians, we say. save us of our sins. Don't we forget the living Jesus. We cannot cancel the faith of Jesus because of our faith in Jesus. And if we're going to really know the faith in Jesus, we have to know and uphold and esteem the faith of Jesus. Jesus came and said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill." He's filled with fresh meaning through proper interpretation. Jesus sometimes interacted on issues of halakha on the highest level when it came to a Sabbath controversy. Jesus said, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." And many Christians said, "Well, Jesus was saying he's above the Sabbath, he didn't keep the Sabbath." Well, if you look at the Jewish literature, very close to this time, the ancient commentary on the book of Exodus, the Megillah, we have Shimon ben Menashe dealing with the verse in Exodus, Shabbat. Shamartim et Shabbat, he quoted Shilachem. He said, "You must keep the Sabbath, for it is holy unto you." Why? Shabbat Masra Lechem, but he had come up to Shabbat. The Sabbath was delivered over to you. You are not delivered over to the Sabbath. How many times in the Sabbath controversies do we see the people asking Jesus a question? They're becoming quiet. Why do Jewish people become quiet? The only time they get quiet is when they agree with you, right? I'm kind of joking a little bit. Well, usually when we have a debate, we just have a professor in Israel says, "Believe it, you got to argue a little bit to study." But I think that instead of viewing the Gospels more as an antagonism between Jesus and his Jewish listeners, I think if we would try to look at Jesus proclaiming ethical monotheism, upholding the law, interpreting the law, applying the law, on ritual purity. Not only did Jesus agree with what would be the accepted Jewish approach today on the Sabbath, or ritual purity. It's what's on the inside of the gut. That's what the Mishnah teaches. He said, well, priests serve in the temple and they're blameless. That's quoted from the Tosefta, another very early Jewish source. We would look at the teaching of saving of life overrides the Sabbath. Over and over again in Jewish literature and discussion, we talk about pikuach nefesh, sefek nefeshot. Life overrides all of the Sabbath laws. And Jesus is flowing with the mainstream of Judaism, which is even a stronger than the criticism that he gives of the Pharisees, are paralleled very closely in the Talmud, which we believe was largely written by the Pharisees or successors of Pharisees, where they criticized the hypocrisy in their own community. If anything, the criticism that Jesus leveled against the Pharisees would argue that he himself felt very close to the Pharisaic movement, and he wanted to bring spiritual revitalization. And he said, do what they teach you. He was saying, I accept the principle of the oral Torah, the oral interpretation of the Torah. And we see him again and again. If Jesus is Jewish and he never changed religions, he interacts with the oral Torah on a high level, debates with the scholars, often receiving acceptance of his position, and he calls for a spiritual revitalization of the hypocrisy. Now, of course, we never have any hypocrisy in the Christian church, I always like the story we have of Gandhi, this day when we're celebrating the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and remembering how he took the Sermon on the Mount, practiced nonviolence, and Gandhi, that one time I asked Gandhi, here you are, you're practicing nonviolence based on Christianity. What do you like so much about Christianity? Gandhi said, Jesus. He said, well, what don't you like about Christianity? Christians! The problem is that when Christians aren't following the teachings of Jesus, as he challenged everyone for this spiritual revitalization. Now, if you look in the Talmud, there are also 7 types of Pharisees that are very negative, except one, maybe 2. I'll talk about the positive ones today. You all know the negative types, all right? But one of the ones that might be positive is the Pharisee of fear, who was like Job, who feared the Lord. But I want to emphasize today, as I'm getting ready to talk about the great Pharisee in the New Testament, that the other good type of Pharisee in the Talmud is a Pharisee of love, like Abraham. And I remember when I was writing my book, Paul the Jewish Theologian, theologian. I've got to look, Jesus is a Jewish theologian out there. But I wrote a chapter on what's probably the most celebrated writing of the Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians 13, which we call the chapter of love, agape love, where the Apostle Paul stresses, how do you love God? How do you love your neighbor? How do you have genuine love? Sometimes we read it at weddings. I think we should read it as we're preparing students to be ordained. You know, I think love means you make yourself vulnerable to be hurt. Love means even when you're hurt, you keep trying. And I think in this Jewish-Christian relationship, we're trying to understand one another. There's a great love that motivates us because Jews really love God with all their heart. Jewish people really love their neighbor. I think Christians are aspiring to that. And when I look at the past years of hatred and animosity, I'm so ashamed of that history. There's nothing I can do to change the history of Christian persecution of the Jewish people for the last 2,000 years. But I'm here today because I want to change the trajectory for the future. I'm here today because I want to stand with Israel. I'm here today because I want to say no to this assault on evangelical Christian support for Israel. We must do all that we can to stress the love, the understanding, to build bridges of understanding with one another. I just want to suggest something to you that Paul was proud of anything. He said, I'm a Pharisee of the Pharisees, a Hebrew of the Hebrews. Maybe that even dealt with his language, his cultural orientation. But if he's writing about love, agape love, maybe there's something of that tradition of the Pharisees, the humane approach that Hillel, the elder, took to don't do to someone what you do not want them to do to you. And we see in this essential document, the Talmud, that it's so important Christians are beginning to study and learn and study more of this rich heritage that's connected to the Bible, the faith, the land. They're beginning to see, well, that emphasis on humility, loving kindness, rachamim, that brings a greater dimension to my study of Scripture that I wouldn't have without the Jewish roots. Christians need to study the Jewish roots. They need to value those Jewish roots. And I think we also see them in the teachings of the Apostle Paul. The big issue when we come to replacement theology is who is Israel in Romans 9, 10, and 11. And we often hear the fact that, well, since Jewish people rejected Jesus, they are no longer a part of Israel. Or the promises made to Israel are not valid, or maybe they've been superseded. There's a triumphalism, or maybe they've passed on to the Christians. I want to say, I think if we really would study the life and teachings of the Apostle Paul and look at his rich Jewish heritage, not only do we see love being emphasized always, but we see a great emphasis on the people in Israel. In Romans 9, 4 through 5, he makes it very clear at the opening of his chapter that he's talking about his brothers and sisters in the synagogue who have not come to faith in Jesus Christ. As a matter of fact, he says, I wish that I could be cut off for them. He had that much love in his heart. I think for many Christians reading this, they realize the intensity that he felt and a great love. But look at the statement that he makes, and I would emphasize, if you read this in Greek and you study it, that it is written in the present tense. He is defining Israel. He says, they are the Israelites. To them belong the adoption as children, and the glory, and the covenants, and the giving of the Torah, and the temple service, and the promises, and to them belong the patriarchs of faith. And from them is the Messiah, according to physical descent, God who is over all be blessed forever and ever. Amen. Well, he says that this is Israel, Israelites who have not accepted Christ. And later on he says, I too am an Israelite. It's like, hey, I did accept Christ, but I'm still part of the tribe. And when he is before the council in the book of Acts, 3 missionary journeys later, far long after the experience on the Damascus Road, Paul declares, I am a Pharisee, and I'm here because I believe in the resurrection. I would like to echo Paul's teachings in Romans 11 I saved them. God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. For I too am an Israelite. I myself am Jewish to the core, we might translate. A descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he has foreknown. Well, we did right. I really like the work that we see with E.P. Sanders or James Dunn, that's better. Some that continue in this older view of replacement theology. But I would like to say that when we start really studying these issues with the Apostle Paul, he is upholding the eternal covenantal relationship with the people of Israel. When it came to the Torah, he said, can we nullify the Torah by the preaching of faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we uphold the preaching of faith. We uphold Torah. We fulfill Torah. Some people like to translate Romans 10:4 as for Christ is the end of the law. Certainly when we look at Romans 3:31, where he says Christ is fulfilling Torah. Faith makes Torah stronger, puts it on a firmer footing. We must translate that Greek word telos in the proper way. Telos almost always in Greek means aim, purpose, goal. The purpose of Torah is to see the non-Jewish world fulfilling the vision of the Hebrew prophets, hinted at in the promises to Abraham that all the families of the earth will be blessed through ethical monotheism, that the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would come to be known through the world. Jesus bringing that message, Apostle Paul mediating it, and this wall of partition is coming down, and people are coming into faith. We are partners together in faith. Has the church replaced Israel? Apostle Paul was saying, no, the church is being crafted in. And the non-Jews are coming to participate together in this wonderful walk of faith that we are dealing with. By studying the Bible, many Christians come to value Israel's eternal significance. Let me say the Hebrew Scriptures of the Old Testament mention Israel some 2,400 times. Israel always refers to the children of Abraham through family, background, and physical descent. The descendants of Abraham are also joined together by monotheistic and ethical faith tradition. The Hebrew Bible, sacred to the Jewish community, teaches this covenantal connection between the people, the land, and the faith. The Newer Testament, sacred to Bible-believing Christians, mentions Israel nearly 80 times, with arguably the exact same meaning for Israel as that derived from the Hebrew Scriptures of the Older Testament. Moreover, Jesus is born in Bethlehem of Judea, rather than Athens, Greece, or Rome, Italy, or Washington, D.C. Likely, Jesus would feel more at home in a yeshiva of Jewish learning than in a home of Christian theological seminary. We've got to remember, Jesus never went to church on Sunday. He didn't go to church on Sunday. He went to the synagogue. He prayed in the temple. He worshipped on Shabbat. Jesus was a Torah scholar, a well-educated scholar of Scripture. Jesus loved Zion. That word Zion comes from the Scripture. People that love the Scriptures like the word Zion. Zionism, that the Jewish people have a home. I'm a Christian. I believe the Jewish people need to have a home in their homeland. Famous Bible scholar David Noel Friedman wrote a book, The Unity of the Bible. He decided the unity of the Bible is that the Jewish people should be at home in their land. I think he was right. And I think Jesus was right when he talked about the times of the Gentiles and the renewal of faith. Well, let me just say, as my time is quickly running out, in spite of years of Christian teachings of triumphalism and replacement theology, it should not be surprising that many students of the Bible uphold the eternal covenantal relationship between God and Israel. In this interpretation of Scripture, God keeps covenant with his people, even when they sin. The ethical monotheism of Jesus and the early church is derived from the legacy of Israel. Consider Corrie ten Boom, highly esteemed evangelical author of the classic book, The Hiding Place, which tells the story of how her from the Nazis in German-occupied Europe. Her family died in the concentration camps. She alone survived. The Tim Boone's family's love for Zion and the Jewish people was rooted in Bible study. I believe that Corey Tim Boone's father derived his view of the Jewish people, much like my own grandfather, Otis Humes, who sent me to Israel for the first time in 1972 and went to Israel himself in 1936. And I would even say probably President Harry Truman, who was a Baptist, grew up hearing a lot of this preaching. And think about President Harry Truman against the prevailing influence of the State Department in 1948, voted to recognize Israel as a nation, in spite of all the political, the right thing to do. I think today the right thing to do is to stand with Israel. The king of Persia sent the Jewish people back to their homeland. Every church and every denomination of Christianity has some leaders who affirm and uphold replacement theology. However, every church and every denomination of Christianity also has some leaders and scholars who recognize that biblical authority. I think the last word of the Hebrew canon, if you read it, 2 Chronicles, as it plays out in the Bible, is Vayal. And you read that last verse, it talks about the king of Persia preparing the way for the Jewish people to go home. What a way in. Vayal, let us go up. Well, I hope that that can be an admonition for all of us today. Let us go up and study Torah together in Israel. Let us study together here, Jews and Christians. Let us go up with true love, brotherhood, sisterhood, with respect with one another. Let us learn and grow together. And we want to stand with Israel today for her security, her protection, even as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King proclaimed so many years ago. Thank you so much.
We're living in some very difficult times in Israel right now. The noble Palestinian resistance yesterday stabbed a pregnant woman, and 2 days ago murdered a woman, a mother of 6 children, in front of her kids in her home. So these are some very difficult times, and what's terrifying to me is not so much the violence itself, but the feeling that I get from too many around the world that we are just getting what we deserve. I don't want to speak today about theology. I don't want to speak about scripture or history or politics. What I want to do right now is a little talk about tachlis, if you will, brass tacks. My topic for today is how Christian Zionism can be an even more effective ally with the Jews for Israel. I'll begin by saying that I am not a Christian Zionist, and I'm not even a Christian. It's important for me to clarify. I speak fairly often at churches, and I tend to get a question at the end. Excuse me, Dr. Shapiro, thank you very much for your comments, but could you say something about the role of Jesus Christ in your decision to make Aliyah or whatever it is? So, I am going to make unauthorized use of the words of the quite fabulous David Brogg, who stood up at a night to honor Israel once and pronounced that he is a Jewish Jew for Judaism. So I'm not a Messianic Jew, I'm not a Jewish believer, I'm not a Jew for Jesus, I am just a plain old regular Jew. What qualifies me to speak about Christian Zionism is that I spent an inordinate amount of time with organizations like CUFI, the International Christian Embassy, Bridges for Peace, Christian Friends of Israel, larger and smaller ministries from all over the world, in conferences, at marches, at prayer groups, intercessionary warfare. I've learned a whole language and managed to publish a few articles and finally a book on this topic. So as I said, the question I would like to explore today is, what does Christian Zionism need to do in order to more successfully function as part of the solution? How can Christian Zionism stand firmly and effectively as an antidote to the delegitimization of Israel and as a credible voice against anti-Semitism? Or in other words, while there are indeed significant external threats to the Evangelical Jewish Alliance, we must also be open to what Jews call a cheshbon nefesh, a
spiritual self-accounting and to wonder perhaps if we ourselves, or you yourselves, are not also functioning, even accidentally, to enable and strengthen some of those very threats. Christian Zionism has a tremendously important role to play in the Jewish-Christian cooperation and support of Israel. Naturally, the two parties, Jews and evangelical Christian Zionists, are not without their criticisms of one another. And I spent a half-page chapter in my book outlining how, in the Christian Zionist worldview, where Jews get some things right and they get some things wrong. But I'm not speaking today about how Jews can be better partners to evangelicals, although that's a great topic. I'm here today to think specifically about Christian Zionism and how to make it a more effective ally of Jews for Israel. My interest in this talk today is not simply to criticize, but to hopefully contribute to the process of figuring out what Christian Zionism needs to do in order to be more effective, more trustworthy, and more honest partner in Jewish Christian support for Israel. Some of what I'm going to say might strike you as controversial. I have a tendency to enjoy stirring the pot. And much of it might not apply to you. You sitting here, this is like the faithful residents of the conference here. This might be something that you're not guilty of, but you need to look out for among your congregants, among your friends, among your students. See if I can make this work. All right. First, I beg of you, please stop disrespecting other Christians. You've got some disagreements, even some major ones, let's say with the Roman Catholic Church, mainline denominations, with the Orthodox traditions. That makes sense. But if you could spend time with Jews without actively suggesting that we're going to hell, I imagine you can find a way to refrain from the whole Whore of Babylon talk as well. Because we Jews see that. We see that. And we think that if you can't find a way to effectively engage with other Christians with whom you share so much, then how will you actually manage to engage with us and accept us Jews? How will we Jews and evangelical Christians learn and grow more deeply together when you reject so many others as not real Christians because you disagree on ecclesiology, eschatology, or some other point that we Jews don't understand as significant? So what I would ask you to do is expand your ability to work together as Christians despite your disagreement. Second, remember that your vision of Zionism is not the only vision of Zionism. There are, and there always have been, different and sometimes competing articulations of Zionism. It is unnecessarily restrictive to assume that your Jewish or Christian friend must share precisely the same Zionist vision as you do or your pastor. You don't have to vote for a right-wing party to be a good Zionist. I know, right? You don't have to have opinion X or Y on Judea or Samaria or on the Temple Mount to be a good Zionist. The folks who vote left in Israel do so because they truly believe from the bottom of their hearts, and they might be wrong, that this is what is best for their beloved country. But they're not less Zionistic than the passionate defender living in a small community in Samaria. Their sons and daughters also endanger their lives to protect the state and her citizens. So stop making them sound like traitors. Develop a love for all who love Israel. Third, get out, engage with more real Jews, more real Israelis. Too often, Jews of Christian Zionist love are expected to act, pray, and even look like King David or Deborah the prophetess, but we're not. This expectation can only disappoint. We don't have superpowers. We don't have a super aim with God, and we are at least as mixed up and messed up as everyone else. So loving the nation of Israel means loving her in her real presence on earth, not some imaginary construct. I ask you to develop a love for all the nations of Israel, to argue on behalf of Israel without reference to the Bible. Now, naturally, it's biblical arguments that motivate faithful Jews and Christians, but that's not what's going to inspire most American youth on college campuses, and it's not what's going to encourage secular Jews to partner with you. I've seen too many Christians question their commitment to Israel once they learned of some of the realities of the quite encourage you to enlarge your toolkit. Fifth, there are 6 in the list. Number 5, don't avoid the really difficult issues. Specifically, we need to have a more honest dialogue about evangelism and the role that it plays in evangelicalism. It's quite understandable to everyone why Jews are deeply concerned with the issue of Christian mission. It is impossible for us to reconcile statements that value our people and our religion with statements that permit or encourage practices that, if successful, will signal the end of our people and our religion. Don't run away from this challenge and this probability of it resulting in profound disagreement. I ask you to respect us enough to risk offending us. Finally, learn more about Jewish-Christian relations. I teach all kinds of Jews and Christians, including lots of evangelical Christian Zionists, and it happens time and time again that Christian Zionists rely on inspiration and slogans that come up a little bit short on actual knowledge or careful thought on complex issues. Read a book, hear a speaker, take a course, learn the facts, and grapple with the real challenges that exist in Jewish-Christian relations. Grow your knowledge and understanding. This last Shabbat, in synagogues all over the world, we read from the Parsha, the section, Exodus chapter 2. And it begins with an interesting word. It starts with the word bo. Bo el paro. It's almost always translated to English as go to Pharaoh, says God. Hebrew speakers understand immediately. Moshe is not being ordered to go to Pharaoh. God is saying to Moses, come to Pharaoh. Beautiful image. It's like God is putting his hand down and saying, Moshe, come on, hold my hand. All right, we're going to do this together. Martin Luther King Jr. recognized this essential truth. The darkness cannot cast out darkness. Only light can do that. Hatred cannot cast out hatred. Only love can do that. It required God to accompany Moses into the heart of darkness that Pharaoh represents. What we're doing here is a holy task. We are holding hands with one another, and we are walking into the heart of darkness, into lies, into fear, into violence, into a lust for power. We are holding hands with one another. Let's also remember we are still holding hands with the Holy One, blessed be He, who has called us out to come with Him on this mission, to cut out darkness and hatred. Thank you.
Every person saying to the end, to hear me speak, he says, hear you speak, I'm the last speaker. That was put to me is why and how Jews and Christians should and must work together for the benefit of the state of Israel. And the short answer is, it depends. Like most things in life. I can come up with 2 distinct sets of reasons for why Christians and Jews should work together. And hear me out, because the difference between them is going to be crucial. One set of reasons are what I call justice reasons, and another set of reasons are religious reasons. Now, rabbis, I have to throw in something biblical, and I have a feeling in this crowd people aren't going to mind terribly. You know, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, Shemos, in our terminology, Moses goes out, he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating on a Jew, and he intervenes and has to take matters into his own hands. He kills the Egyptian. Okay? The very next narrative has Moses at an unspecified time later in the land of Midian as a stranger in xenophobic territory, seeing a group of young women in distress, and without asking anyone, he intervenes, 6 guns a-blazing, rides down on his trusty steed, and rescues the women. Why are these 2 narratives juxtaposed? One of the great teachers of the early 20th century, mid-20th century, Yerucham Lubavitch, says that the
second narrative is crucial to the first. Don't think that Moses was compelled to act for nationalistic fervor, for jingoistic reasons. God wanted you to know that Moses was just as eager and quick to react to save someone else from a miscarriage of justice as he was to act on behalf of one of his own brethren. Maimonides, the great philosopher, the Middle Ages, writes in Guide to the Perplexed that this is the way God generally treats his prophets. He's only interested in people who have this oversized sense of justice. If something is wrong, they will rise to the occasion no matter where they see that miscarriage of justice. I've met a good number of people like that. One of them is sitting right here to my left. You Dexter. I hope this won't be a violation of a confidence, but I was floored once when I heard Dexter talk about why he got interested in defense of the state of Israel. Dexter's not an evangelical Christian, as I believe many attendees here are. He comes from a very historic mainline church. But Dexter looked around one day and said, you know, this just doesn't make sense. My ancestors literally came over on the Mayflower. They were people who risked their lives to start a new lifestyle that offered religious liberty and tolerance for everyone. To think that my church is now doubling down and beating up on Israel was more than I could take. So there's nothing in it. There was nothing in it for Dexter other than the perception that an injustice had been done. I once worked with a council for academic affairs. Anybody here from the council? Non-Jewish woman, young non-Jewish woman who was pursuing her PhD dissertation in political science. And she started off with an anti-Israel bias until she started studying. And the more she studied, the more she realized that Israel was getting a bum deal. And she got so incensed by it that she essentially devoted the next years of her life in defense of the state of Israel. I worked with a group of Presbyterians, of all people. One of the leaders in anti-Israel resolutions, but a group of people for very different reasons than evangelicals support Israel and work tirelessly on her behalf. If you ask any of them, it's not because of any covenant, any kind of promise in Genesis. It's because, as Christians, they are incensed by the injustice being done. Constantly. In world fora, in the press, in academia, in the treatment of Israel. Justice demands that people recognize that Israel, the only democratic state in the Middle East, the only one where Christians are safe, where Christianity is growing, where women and gays do not have to fear for their lives, that's the country that so many churches have targeted as the only target of their venom. There's a gross injustice being done, and it makes sense for people who are interested in justice, as all religious people should be, to be working on the same team to correct that injustice. That one people on the face of the earth should not be entitled, especially one that has offered and continues to offer the world so much. Not a perfect state, but I couldn't find one if I tried. No more or less perfect than any other. But yet, the target of so much animus and so much contempt. Behind the injustice are two themes that affect Jews and Christians alike. They always have and they always will, even when people didn't recognize them. Behind
combat anti-Semitism and realize that that's behind a lot of the anti-Israel activity. And the second theme is the agenda of the far left, which affects Jews and Christians and really all of mankind equally. An agenda that would have us naively erase all notions of nationhood, of borders, of private property, of power, of authority, and all distinctions between people, even when valued. That is a threat to all of us, Christians and Jews alike. That's what I call the justice reasons. There's a whole other set, which I call the religious reasons. I can let my hair down if I have any hair. There are another set of Christians, often overrepresented in the ranks of Israel supporters, usually conservative Christians, who respond to Israel for another set of reasons. Some of them, well, they include traditional evangelicals. You've heard today, I assume, about left-leaning evangelicals. I still think there's plenty of traditional evangelicals left, and certainly Pentecostals, the single fastest growing religion in many parts of the world. In their ranks, without minimizing the extent of theological difference between believing Christians and believing Jews, the sheer amount of overlap in values is staggering. Values that are now threatened in a rapidly changing society and that require a new partnership and a new alliance between believing Christians and believing Jews for our own preservation. It happens to be that belief and support of the state of Israel is often the glue that brings us together. An interesting thing about both evangelicals and traditional Jews, neither of them was interested in the traditional interfaith dialogue that's been going on for 60, 70 years. Both of them said, I don't need other people whom I respect and they love dearly, but I don't really need them to tell me how to study my scripture. I have other things and better things to do with my time. They both sat on the sidelines. And now we find ourselves, two communities that are staring down a society, well, how should I put it? It used to be, remember the old days when they said, the guy drinks or she plays sports like there's no tomorrow. Remember that phrase, like there's no tomorrow? Well, today we're looking at a society in which there is no yesterday. There is no yesterday. Yesterday and anything before yesterday simply doesn't count. And we know how that cannot be, and how that is not God's will. And that we believe we have the shared belief in a God who creates, a God who cares about humankind and individual people, who legislates morality, that means law, binding, normative, who assigns limits to human behavior, personal and political. All of this, as you probably have figured out, can be reduced to two words. Law is one of them. What's the second word? Bible. A common belief in the power of the Bible, seeing it as the will of God. Among Christian Zionists, again, I imagine you've heard lots before about Christian Zionism. I hope I'm not going to be too repetitious in just reviewing the fact that there are two potent forms of Christian Zionism out there. One, the one that the Jews in the audience probably have heard of, even though it's the minority one. Premillennial dispensationalists. I love them. Great people. I love Kufi. More power to them. Theologically, it's not where most evangelicals are. It's not. mentioning it because the state of Israel cannot afford to miss the other 60 or more % of evangelicals who are not premillennial dispensationalists and have a different kind of Christian Zionism. Their Christian Zionism comes from the fact that when they look at the rebirth of a country, of a nation, they may not attach it to a particular biblical prophecy. They may argue theologically, too much for us, we can't buy it. But the idea that God maintains his covenant, his promise with the people, is something that has value to believing Christians because they realize that there are several covenants that God made. He does have a special covenant with the Jewish people, at least I think so, but he has a covenant with mankind as well. That covenant with mankind is also bolstered and backed by promises. When you see God maintaining his covenant with the Jewish people, it offers support to the idea that God will always be with all of mankind in that covenant. So coming together, the larger issue behind it, lurking behind it, is what's happening with society and where Jews and Christians who are brought together by this appreciation of this great state of Israel can be brought together to work for a better America, for a better world in which the honor and glory of God are allowed to shine again among people, still I believe the majority of the American people who believe strongly in the Word of God. But they need a little reminding from time to time. And this is where Jews and Christians can help each other. I was appalled by the reaction of the evangelical community. Again, I'm not stepping on anybody's toes. Spoken to friends, they looked at the Pew Report and said, Catholics are down to below 50% retention. We got 69%. 69% makes you happy? Shouldn't it be a little closer to 100? But people have been a little too blasé, a little too self-confident for too many decades. You look out from your left turn and you see churches full of people, hey, everything's great, not realizing where the young people are going, what kind of questions they're carrying in their minds, why they're a little less enthusiastic about the Bible. What are we doing about it? Here is where, and with this I'll conclude, the two sets of reasons that I gave you actually come together strategically. One of the most difficult positions for Israel to be in is to base its existence or its legitimacy on the Bible alone. Now, I'm a believing Jew. I have no problem doing that. But for the state of Israel to exist without the hand of God coming down visibly from heaven, we have to go through some steps that conform with natural law, the way things are done in the general community. The world won't buy the idea of an Israel that is legitimate because God said so. Too many people think that that's not the case. You don't believe in God in the first place. But one thing that is killing Israel, ladies and gentlemen, is a pack of lies about when Israel got started, its legitimacy, how it got here. That pack of lies, unfortunately, was propelled a lot by our president's initial address in Cairo, giving new vitality to the idea that the state of Israel was created as a post-Holocaust event, denying all of the 2,000-year history before and 150 years of build-up of the land. We're talking about a generation that has only seen Israel through the eyes of media that are hostile, as camera attests every day. They never saw the Israel who was the David, only the Goliath, and people have been too eager to play on that. As religious Christians and Jews, we have to be able to articulate the justice reasons. Our young people want the justice reasons. churches, Jewish synagogues are not as disease of evil. That's part of the strategy. We have to be able to work together to think about the general picture of what's been happening to society and get together and pool our resources. What are the ways that we've discovered to keep young people involved? Too often we speak old speak. We use old techniques, we use old marketing. We're not using social media, YouTube. Things have changed. People don't read anymore. Are we out there presenting God? Presenting God in terms of people that young people particularly can relate to. We could be doing a lot of work together. I'll conclude with just addressing a few words. I understand that someone before addressed a few words to our Christian friends. I'd like to address a couple of words to our Jewish friends here. Our job is to cut through the hostility of 2,000 years of a very different relationship with the Christian world. We can't fault our Jewish brothers and sisters for taking a while to learn. There's a lot of history, and the more traditional and observant people are, the more of a sense of history they have. We still have the grandparents, and sometimes the parents who are the Holocaust survivors. They can tell just too many stories about their neighbors who turned upon them. But we have to tell the other stories. Which Christians it was who risked their lives in the Holocaust to save Jews. How those whose parents were anti-Semites are today the greatest philo-Semites. Why it happened, and that it did happen. We have to be more out there in explaining to other Jews that there is a new era of understanding and bridge building, and we have to be able to accept the embrace of friends from outside the Jewish community, especially when it comes from a great place, meant to serve the honor of God. Thank you.
Exactly what they portend, but we know that there are some ominous signs, and we can see them, we can document them at this point, and we are documenting them, and we are going to be active